Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity gets cozy and the stranger corners of the world are given a softer light. Tonight's gentle journey is all about a fear that can arrive without warning, even when the water is calm, the weather is kind, and nothing at all appears to be wrong. It begins with a glance downward, a little look into blue water, a pause, then a tightening in the stomach, a small jolt in the chest, and the odd conviction that perhaps it would be far better not to know what lies beneath you. Before we drift any farther into this one, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are you tucked into bed in a quiet room somewhere inland, far from any shoreline at all? Or are you nearer the sea, perhaps close enough to hear wind moving past the windows? And while you settle in, think for a moment about this. Have you ever looked into deep ocean water and felt uneasy? Not because you saw something, but because you couldn't. If you find this soothing or interesting, or simply a gentle way to unwind after a long day, I'd be ever so grateful if you liked the video, maybe subscribed, and stayed with me for the rest of our slow little descent. It helps this calm corner reach other people who may also want something quiet to listen to while the day lets go of them. Now, I do hope the deep ocean doesn't keep you awake, but if it does, at least you'll have company and perhaps a better understanding of why the sea can feel so peaceful from the shore and so unsettling the moment it turns dark under your feet. So, settle in, loosen the day from your shoulders and let your breathing slow a touch. Because somewhere between the glittering surface and the cold black water far below lies a fear many people recognize immediately, even if they've never learned its name. It is the fear of the abyss. More precisely, when we speak of the ocean, it is often called Abyssophobia, a fear of immense depth, of bottomless darkness, of what may be waiting beyond sight. And unlike many fears that need a loud sound or a sudden movement to wake them up, this one can begin in complete silence. It is a strange kind of fear, because the ocean often introduces itself so politely. At the beach, it seems almost friendly. Children run into it with plastic buckets. Families float in the shallows. Holiday photos are taken. Somebody is always eating crisps that become slightly damp for reasons no one fully understands. The water near shore is bright and readable. You can see your feet. You can see the sand. You can tell yourself that this is manageable. This is a world with edges, with clear rules, with a visible floor. Then, very gradually, the floor disappears. That moment matters more than it seems. One instant you're in water, the next you're in depth. And those are not the same thing. Water you can understand. Depth is different. Depth removes reference points. It takes away the comfort of seeing where things end. It asks your mind to tolerate a space that has no immediate boundary, no clear answer, and no obvious guarantee. That is when a perfectly ordinary swim can become a very uneasy negotiation between your reason and your imagination. Many people know the feeling. You're swimming from the shore toward a floating platform, or maybe you're out on a boat and decide quite confidently that jumping in sounds refreshing. For the first few moments, everything is fine. Then you make the mistake, if we can call it that, of looking down. Beneath you is not sand or rock or sea grass waving lazily in the sun. Beneath you is blue that darkens into darker blue, then into a shade that seems to stop being a colour at all. It does not tell you how far it goes. It does not reveal what moves there. It simply remains open, and your body, far faster than your thoughtful mind, decides that openness of that sort may be a terrible idea. What is especially curious is that the fear does not always come from an actual threat. Quite often, there is no shark, no storm, no strong current, no real emergency of any kind. The danger may be very small or even absent, and still the body reacts as if a meeting has been arranged with catastrophe. The pulse quickens, breathing becomes shallow, muscles tense. The mind begins offering unhelpful suggestions at impressive speed. Something is beneath you, something large, something ancient, something with too many teeth, or perhaps no teeth at all, which can somehow feel worse. The imagination is not known for restraint in these moments, and that is one reason this fear is so compelling. It is not merely about the sea as a place. It is about what happens when the human mind meets a space too large to read properly. We are creatures that like clues. We like horizons we can judge, rooms with walls, roads with signs, fields with tree lines, even if the signs are slightly wrong, and the tree line turns out to be a shopping centre. We are calmer when the world provides scale. Deep ocean does not provide scale. It refuses. The surface may sparkle politely, but beneath it there may be hundreds or thousands of meters of water. Your mind tries to measure it and fails. That failure has a feeling. For many people, that feeling is fear. There is also something quite personal about the way abyssophobia shows up. Not everyone fears it in the same form. For one person, it appears while swimming over a drop-off where the seafloor falls away without warning. For another, it arrives on a boat at night when the water beside the hull looks black and heavy, as though it has switched off all friendliness. Some people feel it while watching underwater footage, especially when a diver's light reveals only a narrow cone in a field of darkness that does not seem to end. Others feel it at aquariums, oddly enough standing perfectly dry behind glass while a very large tank gives just enough suggestion of deep water to make the stomach step back an inch. There are even people who feel it from images alone. A photograph of a lone swimmer in dark open water, a satellite view of the ocean where the coast falls away into an enormous blue plain, a shot taken from the back of a boat, looking straight down into water so dark it might as well be a hole. The body can respond to all of these, not always dramatically, not always with full panic, but with a low, recognisable unease, a reluctance, a sense that this place is not made for us, and that perhaps we have wandered a little too close to something we do not fully understand. In fairness, the ocean has done very little to correct that impression. It is not exactly a reassuring institution. The sea contains crushing pressure, freezing temperatures, sudden storms, unfamiliar animals, hidden trenches, and a level of indifference that is almost impressive. It has swallowed ships, rearranged coastlines, and inspired enough cautionary tales to fill libraries. Even on its best behaviour, it is vast beyond ordinary intuition. Stand on a beach and look outward. What you see is only the skin of it. Under that surface is volume, movement, cold, silence, and distance on a scale that the human nervous system does not love. And yet the fear of the abyss is not simply fear of drowning, though that may overlap with it. It is not just fear of sharks, though popular culture has tried its very best to insist that every unsettling ripple in the sea is one badly timed soundtrack away from disaster. It is not even only fear of the unknown in the broad sense, it is more specific than that. It is the discomfort of downward vastness, the dread of what cannot be surveyed, the particular human distress that arises when the world opens beneath us and offers no bottom, no shape, no quick answer. If you think about it, most of our daily lives happen on surfaces. Floors, sidewalks, roads, fields, carpets, kitchen tiles, which are occasionally more dangerous than expected if a sock gets involved. We move across stable plains. Even when we climb, we usually know the ground is still there somewhere below us, fixed and dependable. But in deep water, that arrangement changes. There is no floor you can trust. There is only suspension. Your body floats, yes, but it also understands that below you lies a column of space in which you cannot stand, cannot orient in the usual way, and cannot see very far. That alone is enough to unsettle a system built over a very long time to prefer footing. The loss of footing is not a small thing. It changes the emotional logic of a place. On land, if you feel uneasy, you can usually step back. In shallow water, you can wade in, then wade out again. In deep water, especially open water, the options feel different. You're not standing near danger. You're suspended inside an environment that would continue perfectly well without you. That realization can be sobering in a hurry. It is one thing to admire a cliff from a marked viewpoint with a railing and a sign that says not to lean too far. It is another thing entirely to float over blue emptiness and realise that below you is a depth no railing was ever going to fix. This may be why the fear often arrives with a sense of exposure. It can feel as though you have become visible in the wrong way. Not because something actually sees you, though the mind enjoys offering that possibility immediately, but because you are now a small, warm, vulnerable creature in a place of enormous scale. The sea does not need to do anything dramatic. Its size is enough. A little swell lifts you, lowers you, lifts you again, and with each movement you become more aware that you're not in charge of very much. That awareness, I think, is important. Many fears have to do with loss of control, and abyssophobia is especially good at triggering that alarm. The abyss cannot be checked quickly. You cannot scan it the way you scan a room. You cannot map it in a glance. Even modern equipment only reveals pieces at a time. Sonar gives outlines. Lights reveal fragments. Cameras show narrow slices. The deep remains mostly hidden, and hidden things invite speculation. Human beings are champions of speculation. Give us a dark, enormous space and no firm answer, and we will populate it with every possibility from reasonable caution to a squid the size of a village bus. To be fair, the ocean has supplied enough unusual life to keep the imagination well fed. Lanternfish, gulper eels, anglerfish, giant squid, creatures with transparent heads, creatures with teeth that seem planned by a committee in a very bad mood, creatures that glow, blink, wavy lures, or appear to have been assembled from spare parts in dim lighting. The deep sea is full of life that does not look designed for our comfort. Most of it is not dangerous to people in the way cinema would like, but danger is not the only ingredient needed for fear. Unfamiliarity can do a surprising amount of work on its own. Still, what many people fear first is not the creature, it is the space. Before the monster, there is the water itself. Before the imagined attack, there is the simple, awful feeling of not being able to tell how much world is below you. And that may be why even very calm scenes can trigger it. Picture a person alone on a paddleboard over deep water far from shore. Nothing happens, no splash, no music, no crisis, and yet many viewers will feel a tightness simply from the setup. The board looks too small, the water looks too deep, the person looks too alone. That is all it takes. There is a practical reason for some of this. Human perception works best when it can gather solid information. In murky or immense environments it gathers less. Less information means more uncertainty. More uncertainty means the brain starts filling gaps. Sometimes it fills them sensibly. Sometimes it fills them like an over-enthusiastic intern who's had too much coffee and a free hand with the disaster folder. In dark water, the unknown is not neutral for long. It quickly becomes charged. A shadow may be nothing. A movement may be current. A colder patch may mean only deeper water. But the body does not always wait for careful interpretation. It prepares first and asks questions later. This is why people can feel embarrassed by the fear while still being unable to shake it. They know, rationally, that a hotel infinity pool is not the Mariana Trench. They know that an aquarium wall is thick, secure glass and not a thin social agreement between themselves and a passing tuna. They know the water below the boat is probably empty of drama. But knowledge does not always calm the older systems of the body. Those systems are not rude exactly. They're just cautious in a way that can be inconvenient for modern leisure activities. There is also a tension here that makes the whole subject especially interesting. Many of the people most unsettled by the ocean are also deeply drawn to it. The sea is beautiful. It is cooling, bright, rhythmic, spacious. It promises escape from noise, from roads, from inboxes, from every little digital chime that has somehow become a feature of adult life. It offers horizons and salt air and the useful reminder that most of our daily concerns are, in cosmic terms, very small indeed. Yet in the same place that brings peace, fear can bloom in seconds. That contrast is part of what gives Abyssophobia its power. The setting is lovely, the feeling is not. A person may stand on a cliff path overlooking the sea and feel perfectly calm. They may walk the beach, admire the waves, even swim close to shore with no problem. Then the water deepens, the colour changes, and the nervous system draws a line. Past this point, it says, we're no longer sightseeing, we're improvising, and I do not care for it. It is a remarkably decisive voice, the nervous system. Rarely subtle, very committed, often certain that the worst possible explanation deserves early consideration. If this fear belongs to you, even a little, there is nothing especially odd about that. It does not mean you are weak, dramatic, or failing to appreciate nature correctly. It means you are human, equipped with a brain that tries to keep you safe by taking missing information seriously. The abyss is by definition a place of missing information. It withholds the bottom, it hides motion, it distorts sound, it absorbs light. It reminds you very efficiently that your species did not evolve with gills, sonar, or any particular talent for being serene above thousands of meters of dark water. And so the fear begins where many fears begin, in the gap between what the world is doing and what the mind can verify. A glittering surface, a darkening below, a body that senses the drop before it can describe it, a mind that starts to wonder what else might be paired with such depth. That wondering can become dread, and dread, when fed by darkness and distance, has a way of growing large very quickly. For tonight it is enough simply to notice that first reaction and treat it seriously, not dramatically, just honestly. The fear of the abyss is not silly. It is a very old response to a very old fact. Deep water removes certainty. When certainty goes, the body pays attention. And in the ocean, especially when the bottom vanishes and the blue beneath you keeps deepening into something almost black, attention can sharpen into a kind of alarm that feels far bigger than the moment itself. Because once the seafloor disappears, something else appears in its place. Not a creature, not yet. Not a clear danger, not even a memory. Just a sensation, a low internal warning that says this space is too large, too hidden, and too deep to trust at a glance. And that is where this fear really starts to take shape. In that first instant when the world below you stops looking like water and begins to feel like an opening. And the odd thing about that first feeling is how quickly it arrives, because looking down into blue water does not sound, on paper at least, like the beginning of a crisis. It sounds almost nice. It sounds like a holiday brochure written by someone wearing linen and making unrealistic promises about inner peace. Blue water is meant to be calming. Blue skies are calming. Blue bedrooms are apparently calming, though I have always suspected a large part of that is simply the absence of meetings. Blue is one of those colours we tend to trust. It feels open, clean, manageable. Then the water gets deeper, the blue gets darker, and something in the body decides that this very same colour has started to behave badly. It is worth lingering here, because the fear does not begin only with danger. It begins with perception. It begins with what the eye sees, what it cannot see, and what the brain does when it realises it has lost its usual grip on distance, shape and certainty. Looking down into deep ocean water is not like looking into air. Air most of the time lets us judge a scene fairly well. Trees stay where trees ought to be. Roads remain visible. Buildings do not usually fade into blackness directly below our feet. Water is different. Water eats detail. It softens edges. It bends light. It hides scale. Even in good conditions, even in clear conditions, it changes the rules of sight just enough to make the brain work harder than it likes. That is one reason the experience can feel so strange. You're not only seeing depth, you are seeing your own limitations. The eye tries to resolve the space beneath you and gets an incomplete answer. The brain then starts doing what brains do, which is to fill the gaps. Sometimes it does this helpfully. It notices the surface, the angle of the sun, the visible sand, the ripples, the harmless little fish going about their day as though they have never once considered how unsettling they may appear from above. But when the bottom is not visible, or only barely visible, the brain has less to work with. It cannot easily tell whether the water below is 10 feet deep or 50, whether the dark patch is shadow or depth, whether the shape passing below is seaweed, current, rock, or the beginning of a very bad afternoon. That uncertainty has a texture to it. It is not always full panic. More often, it begins as a pull in the stomach, a tightening across the ribs, a subtle alertness that was not there a second earlier. A swimmer might be floating quite calmly, face down, arms out, legs drifting behind, listening to their own breathing through a snorkel when they move from clear shallows over to darker water, and something changes instantly. Nothing touches them, nothing rushes up, no dramatic music appears from nowhere, which would at least be considerate, and yet the body reacts. It knows, before the conscious mind has put the thought into words, that the scene beneath it is no longer easy to read. One of the most unsettling parts is how little has to happen for this feeling to appear. The water does not need to be stormy. It does not even need to be cold. In fact, sometimes warm, beautiful, tropical water can make the sensation worse because it creates such a misleadingly friendly first impression. The sun is out. The surface is sparkling. The colour is lovely. You're in what should, by all reasonable standards, be a postcard. Then you float beyond the place where the sand remains visible, glance downward, and suddenly the postcard becomes a void with excellent lighting. Many people remember a first moment like this quite clearly. Perhaps they were children, standing in the sea and feeling brave because the water still reached only their waist. They stepped a little farther. The waves lifted them. They looked down and realized they could no longer see their feet, which is a small event physically but not always emotionally. Or perhaps they were older, swimming in a bay, and the bottom changed from pale sand to a darker channel where the water deepened quickly. It is amazing how much comfort can be provided by simply seeing the ground beneath you, and how quickly that comfort leaves when the ground is gone from view. There is something almost mechanical about that loss of comfort. As long as the bottom is visible, the brain can map the space. It understands where you are in relation to it. It can say more or less, here is the water, here is the floor, here is the distance between the two. Once that reference disappears, the environment stops behaving like a place and starts behaving like a volume. That shift matters. A place feels containable. A volume feels open-ended. Human beings generally enjoy containers. We like cups, rooms, jackets, train schedules, and sandwiches that hold together. Open-ended volumes are less popular, especially when they are dark and cold and technically full of pressure. Water also has a very unhelpful talent for disguising depth through colour. In shallow areas, sunlight bounces off pale sand or rock, and the water looks bright, almost cheerful. As depth increases, less light returns. Red wavelengths disappear first, then orange, then yellow, until the water takes on deeper blues and greens. To the eye, this can create a gradient that is beautiful from shore and unnerving from inside it. The deeper the water, the less visual information comes back to you. It is as though the sea politely accepts the light, thanks you for it, and then declines to return any useful details. That matters because our sense of safety is deeply tied to visible structure. You can see this on land as well. A staircase feels safe when each step is visible. A hallway feels safe when there is enough light to make out the walls. Turn off the lights and suddenly a familiar room becomes an argument between memory and caution. Water does something similar, except the room has no walls, the floor may be absent, and your body is floating in the middle of it trying very hard to remain dignified. It is not ideal. And there is another difficulty. Looking down into water means looking into a world that is oriented differently from the one we are built for. On land, down usually means ground. In deep ocean water, Down means distance. It means a three-dimensional drop extending beneath you while you remain suspended above it. That alone can create a sense of exposure that is hard to explain to someone who has never felt it. It is closer, perhaps, to the feeling of leaning over a great height than to ordinary swimming, except even that comparison fails in one important way. On a cliff, gravity is obvious. On water, buoyancy gives a misleading sense of safety. You are supported, yes, but only conditionally, only while you continue cooperating with the situation. It is a little like sitting in a chair made of technique. This is where the body starts to participate in the fear. The eyes signal uncertainty. The body responds with alertness. Heart rate increases. Breathing changes. Muscles tense. Suddenly, the act of floating, which a moment ago felt effortless, becomes work. People kick more quickly. They lift their heads sooner. They look toward shore, toward the boat, toward any object that seems fixed and terrestrial, and properly committed to being solid. Rationally, they may know they are fine. Physiologically, they are not receiving the memo. Part of that reaction comes from the fact that human beings are very good at noticing when they are unsupported. Not in a philosophical sense, in a literal, practical mammalian sense. We like footing, we like balance, we like knowing where our weight can go if we need to move suddenly. Deep water removes those options. You cannot plant your feet. You cannot brace against much. You cannot quickly climb onto the concept of reassurance. You can float, tread, swim or climb if there is something nearby, but the general arrangement is clear. You are in an environment where your usual physical rules have been suspended along with you. The visual side of it becomes even stranger when conditions are imperfect, which they usually are. A little surface chop can break up the image below. Clouds can shift overhead. Reflections can flash across the water. Sediment may reduce clarity. Seagrass may sway in and out of view in ways that seem entirely innocent to marine biologists and completely unacceptable to the average uneasy swimmer. Movement below the surface is particularly difficult for the brain to judge. A shadow drifting 10 feet beneath you can appear larger, nearer and more purposeful than it truly is. Something small and harmless can feel significant simply because it occupies a space the mind already distrusts. This is one reason underwater videos can be so unsettling, even when nothing overtly threatening occurs. A diver points a light downward. The beam reveals particles drifting in the water, maybe a rope, maybe rock, maybe the fading outline of something that could be a wall or a drop. The rest remains dark. The viewer's mind does not sit quietly and accept this limited information. It begins composing possibilities. And because the deep sea has a strong reputation for containing creatures that appear to have been designed after a long and unsuccessful debate, those possibilities are rarely cheerful. Still, the strange feeling of looking down into blue often starts before any thoughts of animals appear. That is important. Popular imagination tends to reduce ocean fear to sharks, as though every uneasy swimmer is simply waiting for a fin and some ominous strings in the background. But many people who fear deep water are not thinking of sharks at all when the feeling begins. They are reacting to depth itself, to unseen space, to the downward extension of the world beyond what their senses can organise. The water could be empty of large life entirely and still feel wrong. In some cases, the emptiness is the problem. Empty deep water can be deeply unnerving because it lacks landmarks. A visible reef is one thing, a rocky bottom is one thing. Even a patch of seaweed, though not universally adored, offers structure. The open blue water beneath you gives almost none. There is no tree, no doorway, no signpost, no useful little arrow saying you're here and the seabed is only moderately far away. There is just gradient. Pale blue, darker blue, then a shade that seems less like a colour and more like the end of information. The brain, deprived of specifics, shifts into caution. This reaction becomes easier to understand when we remember that perception is not just passive viewing. The brain is always predicting. It builds a model of the world from incoming signals and prior experience. Most of the time, this works very well. You see a floor and understand it as walkable. You see a chair and understand that it will probably continue behaving like a chair, which is more than can be said for certain budget office furniture. In deep water, the predictive model gets shaky. The brain does not receive enough stable cues to say confidently what lies beneath, how far away it is, whether it is moving, or what might emerge from it. Prediction becomes less certain. Less certainty means more vigilance. There is also a subtle sensory mismatch involved in swimming over deep water. Your inner ear, your muscles, your vision, and your sense of body position are all negotiating an environment that does not behave like land. You may be horizontal while floating, but your eyes are looking downward into a vertical drop. Your limbs are moving through resistance, but without the fixed feedback of a floor. Waves may lift and lower you without warning. The horizon may vanish if you put your face in the water. Each of these things is manageable on its own. Together they can create a low-grade feeling that the body is not fully in control of the scene. That low-grade feeling can become quite intense when the water is especially clear. Oddly enough, greater visibility does not always help. Sometimes it makes the fear sharper. Seeing very far down without reaching a visible bottom can be more disturbing than murky water, because now the eye confirms depth while still failing to resolve it. You're given just enough information to know this is very deep, but not enough to make that depth feel bounded. Clear blue water over a drop-off can feel like hovering above an opening in the world, and that impression can be difficult to shake. Snorkelers often describe this exact moment. Near shore, everything is pleasant. They see fish, sand ripples, perhaps a friendly little patch of coral behaving itself. Then the reef edge arrives. Past it, the seafloor falls away sharply into open blue. The fish continue, entirely unconcerned. The water remains beautiful. But the body responds as though a line has been crossed. The snorkeler lifts their head, checks their surroundings, perhaps turns back towards shallower water while insisting to themselves that this is only a preference and not, under any circumstances, a retreat. It is often very much a retreat. Boats create their own version of the same sensation. Looking down from the side of a boat into deep water can feel strangely intimate, almost intrusive, as though you have looked into a space not meant to be inspected that way. There is the hull beside you, familiar and solid, and then immediately below it the water darkens into depth. You may know perfectly well that the boat is safe, the sea is calm, the harbour is monitored, and nothing dramatic is happening. Yet the view downward can still produce a little recoil. Part of this is scale. The water beside a boat often looks thicker somehow, denser, more serious. It is the same water, of course, but context changes perception. Near a large object, depth becomes easier to imagine and harder to dismiss. Night makes everything worse. This is one of the few facts about the human imagination on which almost everyone agrees. In daylight, blue water at least offers colour, sparkle, motion, and occasional reassurance. At night, the surface becomes dark glass or black fabric or simply absence. Looking down into water, then, is no longer an exercise in failed distance judgment. It becomes an encounter with pure hiddenness. Even people who enjoy the sea by day often find open water at night unsettling in a very immediate way. The view provides almost nothing, and the mind, receiving that nothing, takes it personally. Children often reveal the roots of this fear quite honestly. A child in a pool may be happy in the shallow end but wary of the deep end even when they can swim. It is not only the depth itself, it is also the colour. Many pools darken toward the deep end because of tile choice, shadow, or simple distance. That visible change in blue can be enough to signal danger. A child may not explain it in terms of perception, unsupported space, and sensory uncertainty. They may simply say it looks scary. And they are not wrong. They are just being more efficient about it. Adults, of course, often try to explain themselves out of the feeling. They say things like, "There is nothing there. I know this area. It is perfectly safe." People swim here all the time and so on. All of that may be true. But the nervous system is not always swayed by statistics. It responds to patterns that have been associated over long stretches of evolutionary time with uncertainty and possible risk. Deep, visually unreadable space qualifies very nicely. The body does not need a confirmed threat. It needs only conditions under which caution has historically been wise, and in fairness, caution around deep water has generally been one of the better instincts available to our species. The ocean is not malicious, but it's not especially forgiving either. Depth can conceal current, cold, fatigue, disorientation, and distance from help. A mind that becomes attentive in such environments is not necessarily malfunctioning. It may simply be leaning hard on the side of not drowning, which from an evolutionary perspective has been a strong long-term strategy. What makes abyssophobia so fascinating is that this practical caution can blend with something more existential, though not in a grand dramatic way, just in an ordinary bodily way. Looking down into deep blue water can make a person feel small very quickly. Not philosophically small, physically small, warm, breathing, finite, and not equipped for what lies below. The blue beneath is not just colour, it is scale without edges, and the human body, which is quite content with bathtubs and reasonably sized lakes, notices immediately when the setting has exceeded its preferred proportions. That is why a calm sea can still be unsettling. We tend to think fear requires movement, teeth, weather, or noise, but stillness can be worse. In still blue water, there are fewer distractions. The view down becomes cleaner, more direct. The darkness below feels more deliberate. There is no crashing wave to blame, no storm to point at, no obvious event causing alarm. There is only the fact of depth itself. For many people, that is more than enough, and once that strange feeling has arrived, it changes the entire experience of being in the water. Every splash sounds different. Every brush of current against the leg becomes suspicious. Every passing shadow below seems to deserve monitoring. Even the act of putting the face back into the water can feel like agreeing to look at something the mind has already voted against. The rational part says, keep swimming. The older part says, absolutely not, and preferably yesterday. So when people speak about the fear of the abyss, this is often where it really begins. Not in the dramatic image of a monster rising from the depths, though cinema has had a lovely time with that idea. It begins with a glance downward, with blue that does not stay simple, with the unnerving moment when a colour associated with calm turns into a signal of distance, lost structure, and unreadable space. That is the strange feeling. It is part optics, part body memory, part imagination, part common sense, and it can happen in a heartbeat. And once that glance downward stops feeling like a view and starts feeling like exposure, the next shift comes almost naturally, because the mind does not stay focused on colour alone for long. It starts tracking what has disappeared, and what has disappeared, more often than not, is the ground. And that is a very particular kind of loss, because when the seafloor disappears, you're not simply losing sight of sand or rock, you're losing a measure. You're losing the one quiet piece of information that had been telling your body, without much fuss, that the world beneath you still made sense. Here is the water, here is the bottom, here is the distance between the two. All very tidy, all very civilized, and then, without ceremony, that tidy little arrangement ends. It can happen gradually, which is almost worse. The sand below fades from bright and clear to soft and uncertain. The ripples become harder to make out. A patch of darker blue appears ahead, and at first it does not seem especially important. It looks like shade, perhaps, or a change in the angle of the light. Then you move forward another few feet and realize this is not shade. This is depth. The bottom has not become a little harder to see. It has begun to leave the conversation entirely. For many people, that is the exact moment the body changes its mind about the whole outing. Up until then, swimming has been an activity. Pleasant, manageable, slightly effortful if one has ignored the existence of exercise for some time, but still a normal human thing to be doing. Once the floor drops away, swimming starts to feel less like an activity and more like a negotiation. Your arms are still moving, your legs are still kicking. The sea remains outwardly polite, but the terms have changed. You're no longer moving over a place, you're suspended over a drop. That drop does something unusual to the mind. It removes the comfort of the known without replacing it with anything solid. On land, if a path vanishes, another path usually takes its place, or at least a hedge, a wall, a fence, a car park, something committed to being there. In deep water, when the seafloor disappears, what replaces it is not another visible feature. It is open space. That is much harder for the brain to organise. It does not know whether to treat that openness as harmless, dangerous, or simply rude. There is a reason the shift feels so immediate. Human beings rely heavily on visual reference points to judge safety. We like to know where surfaces are. We like to know how far away they are. We like to know whether they remain surfaces or become inconveniently vertical. In shallow water, the seafloor does a great deal of emotional labour. It reassures, it anchors. It says if all else fails, there is still ground under this. Perhaps not immediately under this, but under it somewhere in a way your body can believe. The moment that assurance is removed, the nervous system notices before your more thoughtful mind has put its spectacles on. That is why a reef edge can be so startling. Snorkelers often describe it in almost the same way. One moment there is coral below, fish moving in and out of familiar structure, sunlight hitting shapes that make sense. Then the reef ends. Past that point, the bottom drops steeply into blue. The fish continue as though nothing has happened, which is unhelpful from a morale standpoint. Your brain, however, does not continue as though nothing has happened. It becomes very aware that the floor has ceased to exist in any useful visual form. What had been a pleasant float now carries the peculiar feeling of hovering above a silent fall. Lakes can produce the same sensation, and sometimes more effectively, because they tend not to advertise it in advance. A beach at the sea at least gives you waves, salt, horizon, gulls, and the general sense that this is a large body of water with ambitions. A lake can look mild, almost domestic. It sits there among trees pretending to be manageable. Then you swim away from shore or jump from a dock and realise the bottom darkens very quickly. Fresh water has its own kind of stillness, and when the floor disappears beneath still water, the effect can be startlingly clean. No surf, no drama, just depth, which frankly is enough. One detail people often mention is the instant urge to pull the legs upward. Even strong swimmers do this. The water below feels suddenly too available. Logically, there is no reason the legs should be safer curled nearer the body. The water is the same water. The depth remains the same depth. But the body dislikes the dangling feeling. It dislikes leaving part of itself extended into an unseen column of space. So the knees bend. The kick changes. The swimmer treads more vertically, as though trying to reduce the amount of person occupying the unsettling part of the scene. There is also an urge to look back toward whatever still seems normal. Shore, boat, ladder, floating platform, anything with edges and a job description. The mind begins taking inventory of escape routes with admirable speed. One moment you are out for a swim, the next you're mentally calculating the distance to safety, the strength in your arms, the degree to which you can pretend this was your plan all along. It is not always panic. Often it is simply an internal narrowing of priorities. We no longer care about leisure. We care about getting back to the area where the world had a visible floor. The disappearance of the seafloor also changes scale in a way that is difficult to overstate. As long as the bottom is visible, the body knows roughly how large the water around it is. Once the bottom goes dark and unreadable, that estimate expands very quickly. The mind does not think, yes, there are now perhaps several additional meters beneath me. It thinks, with great efficiency, This could go on forever. Of course, it does not go on forever. Geography eventually intervenes. But emotionally, that is beside the point. The moment depth becomes unmeasurable to the eye, it acquires a kind of exaggeration. It stops feeling like depth and starts feeling like vastness. That feeling is strengthened by the fact that water gives almost no useful clue about what lies just beyond visibility. On land, a shadow under a tree is still a shadow with a tree attached to it. In water, darkness can mean depth, suspended particles, rock, weed, cloud cover, current, or simply distance. The brain hates that sort of ambiguity. It wants an answer, or at least a category. Instead, it gets suggestion. Suggestion is the favourite food of unease. A person floating over a drop-off is therefore managing more than one thing at once. There is the physical task of staying afloat, which for many people already uses a fair amount of concentration. There is the visual uncertainty below. There is the loss of scale. There is the body's alert response, which changes breathing and muscle tension. And then there is imagination, always eager to contribute in the least useful way possible. When the seafloor disappears, imagination does not normally say, "How interesting." Perhaps this is a valuable opportunity to examine marine topography. It says, what if there is something below, and what if it has already noticed us? Even when no creature is imagined, the drop itself can feel active, almost as though it were not merely a place but an opening. This is one reason people sometimes compare the experience to heights, though the comparison is imperfect. Looking over a cliff gives you a visible drop and a clear sense of danger. Looking into deep water gives you a concealed drop and an unclear sense of danger, which can be more difficult to settle. At least a cliff is honest. It says, here is the edge and here is the fall. Deep water says, well, there is definitely more beneath you, but I'll leave the rest to your nervous system. Colour plays a large part here. We trust light blue because it usually comes with information. We distrust deep blue because it withholds it. Shallow water is readable, deep water is not. The progression from one to the other can happen so smoothly that the body experiences it as a change in mood rather than a change in environment. The sea has not moved. The sky has not darkened. No alarm has sounded, but the blue below your chest has thickened into something that no longer feels casual. That alone is enough to shift the entire experience, and if the water moves beneath you, even gently, the effect can increase. A swell rolls through. Your body lifts and falls. The visible surface pattern changes. What little reference you had becomes less stable. This is not dangerous in itself. Swimmers and divers manage small motion all the time, but when the bottom has already vanished, movement feels different. It reminds you that you're not above the water in any commanding sense. You are in it, held by it, and at least partly subject to what it decides to do next. Some people notice this most strongly from above rather than within the water, standing on a pier for instance and looking down where the seabed is no longer visible. The posts vanish into green or blue darkness. Fish drift in and out of sight and then disappear under the structure. The water directly below seems thicker than the water farther away, as though the shadow of the pier has turned it into a separate substance. It has not, of course. Water is not taking on extra responsibilities under the pier. But perception changes. Depth close to a fixed object becomes easier to feel and harder to ignore. Piers, harbours and moored boats have another unsettling quality. They suggest hidden understructure. Chains, ropes, ladders, barnacles, maybe old tyres, maybe beams or supports coated in growth. Maybe any number of things your foot absolutely does not wish to discover by accident. When the seafloor is gone, those half-imagined structures begin to matter more. The mind starts constructing a map of what cannot be seen, and because it must construct this map without sufficient evidence, it tends to make one that is more eerie than necessary. Then there is the moment after someone jumps in from a boat. This is a fascinating little drama because it begins with confidence. People stand at the edge, take a breath, leap, hit the water, come up laughing, and for 1 or 2 seconds everything is splendid. Then they tread water, look around, and remember there is no visible bottom. Suddenly the joke gets shorter. The boat becomes extremely important. The ladder becomes, in emotional terms, the finest engineering achievement in human history. No one says this out loud because pride is a powerful social force, but the body knows. The body knows the floor is gone. The vanishing seafloor can also disturb people who are perfectly comfortable in pools. That makes sense. Pools have edges, walls, lane lines, ladders, tiles, and a known depth printed in large practical numbers. A pool says exactly what it is. Even the deep end, while not loved by everyone, remains a contained problem. The ocean does not print its depth every few feet and install a polite handrail. It provides considerably less customer service. So a person may feel confident in a 12-foot pool and deeply uneasy in open water that is no more dangerous at that moment, simply because one environment is bounded and the other is not. Boundaries matter more than we often admit. They tell the body when to relax. A room with walls is different from a field at night. A staircase with a railing is different from a ledge without one. In the same way, water with a visible bottom is different from water that drops into blue and leaves the rest undescribed. The absence of a boundary does not automatically create danger, but it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is often enough to wake older, louder parts of the brain. That older response is especially easy to trigger when the drop happens suddenly. Some coastlines do this. One moment you are wading. A few steps later the sand shelves off and the body finds itself in deeper water with very little warning. There is often a genuine physical jolt there, and not only because buoyancy changes. The mind had prepared for one environment and has abruptly been moved into another. Even if the swimmer adjusts quickly, the memory of that sudden loss of footing lingers. It teaches the body that what looks simple from the surface may not remain simple under it. Memories matter a great deal here. Once a person has had one sharp moment of alarm when the bottom vanished, the mind starts watching for it in future. The next swim may begin with a little more caution. The first dark patch is noted more quickly. The distance from shore is monitored more closely. None of this is irrational. It is the ordinary way the brain learns from emotionally charged experiences. But it also means the disappearing seafloor can become not just a momentary trigger, but a pattern the body begins to anticipate. That anticipation can make the fear arrive earlier and with less evidence. A swimmer sees darker water ahead and reacts before the bottom is truly gone. A diver on a boat imagines the view below before entering at all. A person on a beach may happily stand in the shallows but resist going farther because they already know what the next visual shift will feel like. The fear is no longer tied only to the real disappearance of the floor. It is tied to the expectation of it. In other words, the body begins trying to solve the problem before the problem arrives. And there is something sensible in that. We are surface-dwelling creatures. We did not evolve to feel entirely at home suspended over a vast hidden drop in cold, moving water. That is not a moral failure. It is a design note. We can learn to swim beautifully. We can dive, sail, map the seafloor and cross oceans. We can become very capable in marine environments. But capability is not the same as deep instinctive ease. The disappearance of the seabed speaks directly to the part of us that still wants ground to be where ground ought to be. So when the bottom vanishes, the fear is not only about what might be down there, it is also about what is no longer under you. There is a difference. People often think ocean fear must be fear of animals, storms, or drowning. Those can be part of it, certainly, but often the first alarm is more basic. The world has removed a support. The eye cannot restore it. The body notices the lack and becomes alert. Everything else comes after that. In that sense, the disappearing seafloor is one of the cleanest triggers Abyssophobia has. It is visual, immediate and physical all at once. You see less. You feel more. The mind starts filling in what sight can no longer provide. And because that change happens in a place where you are already somewhat vulnerable, floating rather than standing, unsupported rather than planted, it can feel far larger than the actual moment would suggest. Still, the moment does not come out of nowhere. It lands on a nervous system that has been learning for a very long time what hidden depth might mean. And once the floor is gone and the body starts to tighten, those older lessons begin to stir, because beneath modern language, holiday swims and sensible reassurance, there is still a much older part of the mind keeping watch around dark water. That older part of the mind is worth spending time with, because when people talk about fear, they often imagine it as a mistake. They picture it as something dramatic, irrational, maybe a bit embarrassing, like a mental smoke alarm that goes off because you made toast and forgot that toast is not meant to resemble charcoal. But many fears are not mistakes at all. They are old systems doing exactly what old systems were built to do. They notice uncertainty. They assume caution is cheaper than regret. They prefer the unpleasant feeling of false alarm to the much more final inconvenience of being eaten, crushed, drowned, or removed from the family line before lunch. That is not a glamorous design, but it is an effective one. Human beings did not arrive in the modern world with calm little therapist brains ready to evaluate every situation in a balanced and evidence-based way. We arrived with nervous systems assembled over a very long stretch of time by one brutal rule. The creatures who survived often passed on their tendencies. The creatures who ignored risk too casually often did not. That does not mean every fear is accurate. It does mean fear has history. Some of that history is very old indeed, older than language, older than agriculture, older than villages, roads, clocks, and every polite modern habit that makes us feel as though we are separate from the animal business of staying alive. Deep water has been part of that animal business for a very long time, long before anyone gave names to oceans, long before maps, lighthouses, ferries, postcards, seaside hotels, and deeply regrettable inflatable flamingos. Water was already one of the great dividing lines in survival. It offered food, roots, cooling, shelter nearby, and a useful place to wash mud off things. It also offered currents, cold, hidden depth, unstable footing, and death of a very quiet kind. You could disappear in water without much ceremony. No roar, no charging hooves, no snapping twig to warn the group. Just a slip, a pull, a depth misjudged, and that was that. A nervous system that took water seriously was not being neurotic, it was being sensible. That may be why the body responds so quickly to dark depth, even when the thinking mind knows the situation is probably fine. The body does not need a lecture on marine safety statistics. It does not need to review local conditions and cross-check them against rescue response times. It sees hidden depth, unstable support, unclear visibility, and limited escape options, and it moves straight to caution. Somewhere in your biology is a system that hears all of this and says, no, we are not treating this casually. That system is not one single piece of the brain, of course. People often talk about the brain as though there is a panic button in one neat location, and a philosopher in another room trying to calm things down with herbal tea and careful reasoning. The truth is messier. Fear involves networks. Senses feed information inward. Memory compares what is happening now to what has happened before. Attention sharpens. The body prepares. Muscles tense. Heart rate changes. Breathing shifts. You become more aware of the environment and more aware of yourself in it. It feels immediate because it is immediate. The body is acting before language has finished tying its shoes. That speed is part of the point. If a dangerous situation required a full committee meeting in the conscious mind before you reacted, your ancestors would have had a very short and eventful time on Earth. Quick systems survived better. They overreacted sometimes, certainly, but evolution has never shown much concern for embarrassment. It values continuation. If an early human avoided deep water 10 times unnecessarily and survived because of it on the 11th occasion, that tendency was not a flaw from evolution's perspective. It was good work, This helps explain why abyssophobia can feel so primal. It does not arrive like a modern opinion. It arrives like a reflex with a backstory. A great deal of human fear is shaped by ancient priorities. Avoid falling, avoid suffocation, avoid hidden predators, avoid unstable ground, avoid being trapped, avoid being far from help. Deep ocean water manages to touch several of those at once. There is uncertain support, reduced visibility, difficult escape, hidden movement, and the possibility, however remote in a given moment, that something important is happening below your level of awareness. That is almost custom-built to get attention. It is also worth remembering that our species is a land species, a clever land species, a tool-using land species, a species capable of building submarines and then voluntarily climbing into them, which is either magnificent or slightly concerning depending on one's mood, but still very much a land species. We breathe air. We orient best on stable surfaces. Our eyes are not especially good underwater. Our hearing becomes less reliable about direction in water. Our limbs can swim, but not with the elegance of animals who belong there. We can learn, adapt, and become highly skilled, yet the underlying fact remains. The ocean is not our native setting. That does not mean we were always separate from water in evolutionary terms, quite the opposite. The story runs much deeper than that. Life itself began in the sea. For most of Earth's history, the drama happened underwater. Long before forests, mammals, birds, and people inventing waterproof phone pouches, there were oceans full of early life experimenting with survival. In the broadest possible sense, water is where all of this started, which makes our unease around the deep a little ironic. The place that gave rise to life remains, for many of us, one of the least comfortable environments imaginable. Still, there is no contradiction there. Origins do not guarantee comfort. A city may be where your grandparents met and still be a terrible place to park. The early oceans of Earth were not scenic wellness retreats. They were dynamic, dangerous environments full of pressure, chemistry, predation, and change. The line from ancient marine life to modern human anxiety is not a direct memory, obviously. You're not floating in the sea because some tiny ancestral organism left you a psychological sticky note saying kindly remain wary of depth. But the long arc of evolution has shaped bodies and brains that are tuned to risk, especially risk involving hidden environments and uncertain survival. Water became both necessary and dangerous very early in our story. Fresh water sources were essential for animals moving across land. Coasts offered food. Rivers and lakes shaped migration, settlement, and travel. Water could sustain life and remove it in the same afternoon. Over many thousands of generations, a species that did not respect that fact was not likely to do especially well. Even now, in fully modern life, notice how quickly the body distinguishes between ordinary land risk and water risk. A person may walk along a high hill path and feel cautious but composed. Put the same person in deep open water a few hundred meters from shore, and the body often reacts more strongly. Some of that is because water adds several threats at once. In water, fatigue matters more, temperature matters more, distance matters more, orientation matters more. Small mistakes have larger consequences. The body, being old-fashioned in the most practical way possible, notices. Ancient environments also shape the kinds of cues our brains take seriously. Movement from below is one such cue. Hidden spaces are another. Sudden loss of footing is another. Open areas with poor visibility are another. These cues did not evolve for open ocean leisure specifically. They are broader than that. But the deep sea happens to gather them into one very efficient package. You are unsupported. The space is hard to read. The environment can conceal movement. The consequences of misjudgment are not trivial. No wonder the system lights up. Memory adds another layer. Human beings are excellent at carrying lessons forward from frightening experiences. A single bad moment in water can teach the body a lot. Perhaps someone once slipped from a rock shelf into unexpectedly deep water. Perhaps they were caught briefly in current, lost the bottom under their feet, or inhaled water at exactly the wrong moment, and discovered that the body does not find that especially charming. Even if the event ended safely, the brain may file certain features under important: dark water, sudden depth, distance from shore, poor visibility. Later, encountering those features again, the body responds early. It does not wait to see whether this is truly the same threat. It prefers a head start. That preference is not random. Brains are prediction machines. They do not simply record the world, they anticipate it. They build expectations from previous experience and act on those expectations quickly. If deep water has ever felt overwhelming, or if a person grew up around stories of drownings, storms, dangerous surf, or large marine animals, those ideas become part of the prediction system too. The next time blue water darkens underfoot, the mind is not reacting to the present alone. It is reacting to the present plus everything it has learned to attach to similar scenes. Culture matters here more than we sometimes admit. An ancient brain does not live in a vacuum. It lives inside a modern human who has seen films, news stories, documentaries, survival footage, dramatic rescues, and enough fictional sea creatures to populate an entire underwater legal system. We inherit not only biological caution, but narrative caution. The sea has been described for centuries as vast, dangerous, mysterious, hungry, merciless, unknowable, and occasionally very poor at returning ships in a timely fashion. Those descriptions stay with us. So when the body reacts to dark water, it is not only biology speaking, it is biology wearing centuries of storytelling. Yet beneath the stories, the base system remains remarkably practical. It wants to know whether you can breathe, stand, see, orient, escape, and predict. Deep open water weakens several of those at once. Breathing depends on effort. Standing may be impossible. Vision is limited. Orientation can be disrupted. Escape requires distance and energy. Prediction is poor because the environment hides too much. It is not necessary for the sea to contain a monster for the body to say this is less than ideal. The conditions alone are enough. Children reveal this very clearly. A child may never have studied marine risk, evolutionary psychology, or threat detection networks, but many still hesitate at dark water. They resist the deep end, dislike murky lakes, or refuse to jump from a boat where they cannot see the bottom. That hesitation is often explained away by adults as simple nervousness. In reality, it may be a very straightforward expression of the same old caution system. The child sees uncertainty, hidden depth, and lack of control, and declines the invitation. Quite sensible, really. Adults often talk themselves into ignoring those signals because adulthood comes with the unfortunate habit of pretending confidence is always superior to caution. This is how people end up saying things like, "It's probably fine," in a tone that suggests they know very well it may not be fine at all. The body, however, is less interested in social performance. It continues monitoring. If the water looks unreadable, if the drop is sudden, if the support is gone, the system remains on alert regardless of whether the conscious mind would prefer to seem relaxed in front of friends. There is another ancient feature involved here, and it has to do with scale. Human beings do not love environments that make them feel physically small and operationally weak. Dense forest at night can do this. Open desert can do this. Large caves can do this. So can deep water. These places exceed ordinary human control. They are bigger than our immediate senses can handle comfortably. In such settings, caution rises because our usual confidence tools stop working. We cannot quickly master the scene. We cannot inspect all relevant details. We cannot be certain what lies just beyond perception. Ancient brains dislike that. The dislike becomes sharper when the environment is not just large but indifferent. The ocean is a fine example of indifference. It is not angry. It is not plotting. It is simply vast, physical, and untroubled by our preferences. To an old nervous system, indifference itself can feel threatening. because it means the environment will not adjust for us. If we tire, the water does not become shallower out of respect. If we panic, the current does not slow down to let us collect ourselves. A world that continues on its own terms is impressive from the shore and more sobering from within it. This is one reason people often describe deep water fear as humbling. The word gets used a great deal, sometimes too loosely, but here it fits. Abyssophobia can make a person feel reduced to basics: breath, buoyancy, balance, distance, visibility. The body strips the scene down to survival variables very quickly. It does not care that you have read books, paid taxes, navigated software updates, or assembled flat-pack furniture without crying. In deep water, your impressive urban achievements carry less authority. The older brain takes over and says, "Lovely, but can we see the bottom?" Another thing ancient brains do very well is detect patterns that once mattered a great deal. Sudden darkening, abrupt movement, loss of footing, isolation from the group. Water often combines these in neat, alarming ways. Imagine an early human near a shoreline, estuary, river mouth, or lake edge. Visibility is poor. The ground gives way unexpectedly. Something moves under the surface. That is not a setting in which calm overconfidence would have been strongly rewarded. Better to pause, better to stay near others, better to assume hidden environments deserve respect. Group safety may be part of the equation too. Humans are social animals, and being separated from the group has long carried risk. Open water can create that feeling very quickly. A person swimming out beyond the others, or drifting a little too far from the boat, may feel uneasy in a way that exceeds the objective danger of the moment. Some of that unease may come from distance itself. Help feels farther away in water, even when it's technically close, because movement is slower and more effortful. The old brain recognizes separation as vulnerability. Add hidden depth, and the signal gets louder. None of this means every fear of the abyss is simply ancient instinct and nothing more. Human psychology is more complicated than that. Personal experience, temperament, stories, films, accidents, family attitudes toward water, all of these shape the final feeling. But the old layer matters because it gives the fear its speed and force. It is why a person can be perfectly rational, perfectly informed, and still feel their body object the instant the seafloor disappears into blue. It also explains why the fear often feels difficult to argue with. Reason operates in sentences. Ancient caution operates in sensations. One says, conditions are calm, visibility is acceptable, there are no immediate signs of danger, and I am wearing proper safety equipment. The other says, hidden deep water, unsupported body, unclear exit, absolutely not. It is not that reason is useless, it helps a great deal, but in the first seconds of fear, sensation usually speaks first. So when we call this an ancient fear, that is not decorative language. It points to something real in how the human nervous system works. The response to dark depth is not some trendy modern glitch created by too many documentaries and a weak emotional constitution. It is built from old priorities. Stay afloat, stay oriented, stay where support exists. Beware hidden spaces. Do not underestimate environments that can kill quietly. That is sober advice, and the body remembers it even when the mind is trying very hard to be breezy on holiday. The result is that a person floating over deep water can suddenly feel much older than the moment itself. Not older in years, older in structure. As though, beneath all the modern habits and reassuring self-talk, there is still a watchman awake inside, one who has no interest in sounding sophisticated, and every interest in getting you back to a place where the ground can once again be seen. And once that watchman is awake, he does not spend much time admiring the scenery. He starts listening for everything the water has failed to explain, especially the part our minds are least willing to leave empty for long, which is the question of what might be hidden there. And once that old warning system wakes up, it does something very human and not always especially helpful. it starts filling the silence. Because the truth is, the unknown by itself is often not enough to frighten us. The unknown becomes frightening when the mind begins decorating it. Give the human brain a gap in information, and it will rarely leave the space empty out of courtesy. It will furnish it, sometimes modestly, sometimes with alarming enthusiasm. And in deep water, what it tends to furnish first is not a chair, not a lamp, and not anything remotely tasteful. It furnishes teeth. That is the peculiar leap, and almost everyone recognizes it in some form. You look into dark water, and do not merely think, I cannot see what is down there. You think, what if something is down there? Not just something, of course, something with intent, something with size, something that has made peace with living in darkness and would, if we are being honest, have a significant home advantage in any meeting between the two of you. The unknown does not stay neutral for long. It begins acquiring features, and those features are very rarely adorable. This happens so quickly that people often mistake it for intuition. They say they had a bad feeling, and perhaps they did. But a bad feeling is often the mind taking uncertainty and turning it into a concrete possibility. That is what imagination does under pressure. It does not say there are many potential explanations and we shall patiently compare them. It says, let us begin with the worst one and work backwards only if time allows. In most daily situations, this habit is mildly inconvenient at worst. You hear a strange sound in the house and think, perhaps an intruder, only to discover it is a cupboard settling, a radiator clicking, or a cat exploring moral boundaries. In deep water, though, the same habit becomes far more persuasive because the environment supports the illusion. The water hides things. That is not imagination. It really does. Visibility is limited. Sound travels oddly. Shapes distort. Depth removes detail. You're already in a place where not seeing is normal, and that gives the imagination a rare luxury. It can make claims that are difficult to disprove in the moment. That is why people can feel such a sharp stab of fear from what is, objectively speaking, only dark water. The fear is not entirely about what is there. It is about the number of possibilities the darkness allows. If the bottom were visible and empty, the mind would settle. If the water were shallow and clear, the body would calm. But once the scene becomes unreadable, every harmless explanation must compete with every alarming one, and the alarming ones tend to arrive dressed for the occasion. Predators, of course, are the obvious candidates. Human beings are very good at imagining predators. Evolution has rewarded that tendency often enough that it is hard to blame us. If a rustle in tall grass turned out to be nothing 9 times, and a large cat the 10th, then overreaction made sense. Deep water triggers the same old logic. A passing shadow could be a fish, weed, current, or variation in light. The body, however, is not giving out awards for elegant restraint. It treats the possibility of a predator as worth early attention. This does not mean every person staring into deep water is secretly thinking of sharks, though sharks receive an extraordinary amount of free advertising in the field of ocean fear. In many cases, the imagined threat is less specific than that. It is not always a shark. Sometimes it is simply a large thing, a shape, a movement, an undefined living presence below. The mind does not need zoological precision to be disturbed. In fact, vagueness can be worse. A clearly identified animal can be reasoned about. An unseen creature in deep water can be anything, which is very generous of the imagination and very rude of the situation. It is remarkable how often the mind adds intent as well. The unknown is not just unknown, it feels watchful. This is a common feature of fear in hidden spaces. A dark room feels not merely dark but occupied. A forest at night can feel as though something is just beyond the trees even when it is empty. Deep water does the same. It does not only withhold information, it suggests the presence of an observer. That observer may not exist, but the body reacts as though it might, and once that feeling appears, every ripple begins to look like a decision. Part of this comes from the way human beings detect agency. We are built to notice patterns that might indicate a living thing rather than a random event. Two lights in the dark become eyes. A sound in leaves becomes movement with purpose. A shadow in water becomes something turning beneath us. This tendency is very old and often useful. Better to briefly mistake driftwood for an animal than to mistake an animal for driftwood and become a cautionary tale. But it means the unknown rarely remains unknown. It becomes inhabited. Stories make this stronger. We do not approach the ocean as blank minds. We arrive carrying films, childhood warnings, shipwreck tales, documentaries, headlines, photographs of things pulled from trawler nets that no one was emotionally prepared to see, and centuries of language describing the sea as mysterious, hungry, merciless, and full of things best left unbothered. Even people who rarely think about marine life still absorb the basic script. The deep contains creatures. Some are large, some are strange. Some have mouths that seem to have been designed during a period of very poor judgment. So when the water darkens below us, the imagination already has a cast list. Cinema, naturally, has done its bit. It has spent decades insisting that looking into dark water is the first step in a deeply personal argument with something prehistoric. But films are only an exaggerated version of a habit that predates them by a great deal. Human beings have always turned hidden environments into homes for imagined danger. Caves had spirits. Forests had wolves, witches, bandits, or something with antlers and a poor attitude. The sea got monsters, sea serpents, leviathans, devourers, giant mouths in the deep, whole islands that turned out to be creatures in a very bad mood. The details change by culture and era, but the pattern is consistent. Where sight fails, stories begin. There is a practical reason for this. Stories are one way communities pass caution along. Do not go too far out. Do not trust calm water. Do not ignore depth. Do not linger where the bottom falls away. A monster tale may be exaggerated, but it trains attention. It wraps risk in memory. A child may not remember a lecture about changing depth contours, current behaviour and limited visibility. A child will remember that the dark patch is where the sea keeps things with teeth. Not scientifically elegant perhaps, but effective in the broad educational sense. And yet even without stories, the mind often supplies its own. A swimmer over deep water may feel compelled to glance down repeatedly, not because it helps much, but because the brain keeps trying to resolve what it cannot resolve. Each glance is an attempt to turn the unknown into something known. Each failed attempt gives imagination more room. There is an almost unbearable tension there. You want to look because not looking feels worse. You dislike what happens when you look because it solves nothing, so you keep checking, which is an excellent way to remain acutely aware of your own fear. This is one of the reasons abyssophobia can be so exhausting. The threat is not clear enough to act on cleanly. If there were a visible problem, you could respond. Swim away, get out, avoid the area, call someone, become productively dramatic. But when the fear is built from hiddenness itself, there is no neat target. You are reacting to possibility. The body prepares for action while the mind struggles to identify what the action should be. It is a very old dance between vigilance and uncertainty, and the rhythm is not especially relaxing. The body's own sensations then join the performance. Once you're frightened, your heartbeat feels more noticeable. Your breathing changes. The water against your skin feels different. Suddenly, ordinary sensations begin to seem suspicious. A brush against the ankle that would be ignored in a pool can become a full internal emergency in open water. Seaweed, current, temperature shift, a tiny fish, your own movement reflected back by nerves. All of these can be interpreted as contact from something larger, because the mind is already primed to believe the unknown has edges, speed, and appetite. That phrase, appetite, matters more than it should. Many fears are tied not just to harm but to consumption. Teeth symbolize that perfectly. Teeth are not merely tools of injury. They are tools of being taken apart. That is one reason they appear so readily in imagination. A dark unknown becomes especially frightening when the mind translates it into a mouth. It is no longer a space, it is an eater. It is not merely beneath you, it is below with a function. This is obviously not a reasonable conclusion most of the time. But fear has never promised to be reasonable. It promises only to be early. Teeth also stand in for a broader feeling, which is vulnerability. To imagine teeth in the dark is to imagine yourself as edible, and the human ego does not enjoy that framing at all. We prefer to think of ourselves as viewers, explorers, researchers, perhaps mildly heroic bathers. We do not like being recast as a possible menu item. Deep water is very good at creating that uncomfortable shift. The moment the unknown feels alive, the relationship changes. You're no longer merely in the water, you're in someone else's environment, and your body knows it has no particular authority there. This is why even people who know perfectly well that the actual danger is low can still feel absurdly exposed. They understand probabilities. They know most open water fear is not followed by attack. They know many deep places are empty of anything interested in them. None of that fully addresses the feeling of being visible from below while unable to see back. That imbalance is a powerful trigger. To be seen without seeing is a very old kind of vulnerability. The dark water becomes not just hidden, but one-sided. It is interesting too that the imagination often makes the unseen thing larger than necessary. A fish becomes a big fish. A big fish becomes something with a silhouette like a submarine, and the personality of a tax inspector. We do this because size explains fear. If the body reacts strongly, the mind wants a threat that seems worthy of that reaction. A tiny harmless creature does not satisfy the emotional logic. So the unknown grows in the mind until it feels proportionate to the alarm. The water below goes from uncertain to deep, from deep to vast, from vast to inhabited by something that could probably swallow several of your current opinions whole. Not all of this is about predators, though. Sometimes the unknown feels like it has teeth, because we give harsh physical spaces the qualities of living things. We personify them. The abyss feels hungry. A trench feels like a mouth. A whirlpool feels like a pull with intention. The seafloor dropping away can feel like the earth itself has opened. This is not abstract poetry. It is ordinary human perception under strain. We make environments into actors when we do not know how else to organize the threat. If the darkness below cannot be understood as a place, it becomes a presence. That presence is strengthened by sound, or rather by the lack of familiar sound. Underwater, hearing is strange. Direction becomes difficult. Surface noises are muffled or transformed. The body loses another tool for tracking what is around it. In that sensory uncertainty, imagined threats become easier to believe. A splash somewhere else may feel nearby. A dull movement may feel large. Silence itself begins to feel like concealment. The sea is not just unseen. It becomes hard to hear in the way the brain expects, which adds another layer of suspicion. Then there is depth as a moral exaggerator. The deeper a place feels, the less harmless anything within it seems. A fish in a tide pool can be charming. The same fish, if you're told it lives 500 meters down in cold black water, immediately acquires an unpleasant biography in the mind. This is not fair to the fish, but fairness is rarely the point. Depth lends menace because depth implies adaptation to conditions we find alien. Anything that thrives where we would fail begins to feel unnerving. It belongs there, we do not. That imbalance alone can make the unknown below feel predatory, even if it is simply busy with its own deeply unromantic fish business. The mind also has a habit of confusing mystery with malice. If we do not understand a thing, we often treat it as if it might be against us. This is true in water, in darkness, in medicine, in bureaucracy, and occasionally in software updates. The unknown is easier to fear when it seems to be withholding answers deliberately. Deep ocean water creates exactly that impression. It does not offer explanation quickly. It keeps its distance, keeps its darkness, keeps its movement partially hidden, and in response the mind starts assigning motive where there may be none. That assignment of motive is one reason the fear can feel oddly personal. The water is not just deep, it feels as though it contains a specific risk for you. A swimmer may know rationally that they are one small body in an enormous ocean and of no interest to most of what lives there. Yet fear narrows everything. The unknown below becomes focused. It feels oriented upward, toward the self. The abyss stops being a general condition and becomes a direct threat. That is a very efficient way for fear to make itself convincing. And if a person has ever seen a real creature appear from below in water, even a harmless one, the effect can last for years. A seal surfacing unexpectedly, a large fish gliding beneath, a turtle arriving silently from the dark. Even these can leave a mark because they prove the central point. Things can emerge from where sight had failed. Once the mind knows that, it becomes more willing to imagine worse examples later. The gap between harmless surprise and imagined disaster is not logically justified, but emotionally it is a short walk. So when the unknown feels like it has teeth, what is really happening is a stack of very old processes leaning in the same direction. Hidden space invites imagination. Imagination supplies agency. Agency becomes predation because predation is one of the oldest categories of danger we have. Stories, memories, and culture add extra detail. Body sensations confirm that something feels wrong. And before long, a patch of deep blue water has become, in the mind, a place where being alive feels a little too noticeable. None of this means the fear is foolish. Exaggerated sometimes, yes. Cinematic, certainly. Very willing to employ creatures of impossible size, absolutely. But not foolish. The mind is doing what it has always done around unclear risk. It is building a model of danger from fragments and preparing the body to survive the worst version of the scene. In the ocean, those fragments are especially powerful because the environment cooperates. It hides enough to make almost anything feel possible. And once possibility starts carrying teeth, the body changes with it. Fear stops being only a thought and begins turning into sensation. The chest tightens, the breath shortens, the muscles prepare. The sea may not have changed at all, but inside the body the conditions are no longer neutral. The unknown has become physical, and the next thing to notice is how quickly that physical response takes over once deep water has convinced the mind there may be more beneath the surface than it is willing to explain. And once the unknown has become physical in the mind, the body wastes no time joining in, because fear is never only a thought, it is a whole event. It has a pulse, a rhythm, a temperature, a posture. It changes the way you breathe, the way you move, the way you interpret small sensations, and the way you judge the world around you. In deep water, this matters enormously, because the body's alarm system does not switch on in a neutral environment. It switches on in a place where breathing already requires some care, movement already costs energy, and calm is far more useful than panic. That is one of the cruel little tricks of abyssophobia. The very environment that makes fear more likely is also the environment in which fear becomes more awkward to carry. On land, if your heart starts racing and your breathing goes shallow, it is unpleasant but usually manageable. You can sit down, lean against something, take a breath, and pretend the whole thing is not happening while staring very hard at a wall. In deep water, the same physical reaction immediately interferes with the tasks that keep you comfortable. Floating becomes less easy. Breathing feels less automatic. Every movement starts to feel more important. The body, trying to save you, sometimes makes the moment feel much worse before it makes anything safer. It often starts with a simple spike of alertness. You look down. The bottom is gone. Something in your chest tightens. It may be only slight at first, barely enough to notice, just a little internal brace as if the body has straightened its tie and prepared for unpleasant business. Then the heartbeat becomes more obvious. Not necessarily wild, not necessarily dramatic, just faster and louder in your own awareness. The body begins moving resources around. Blood flow shifts, muscles prime themselves, attention narrows. The environment, a moment ago broad and scenic, becomes a problem to monitor. That narrowing of attention is useful in a clear emergency. If something immediate is wrong, focused attention can help. But in deep water, where the trigger is often uncertainty rather than a visible threat, narrowed attention can make everything feel more intense. You stop noticing the broader setting and become very aware of each little sign that might confirm the fear. A darker patch below, a brush of current against the leg, a swell lifting you without permission, a distant splash. The mind begins sampling the environment for threat while ignoring everything that might have made it feel ordinary. Breathing is one of the first things to change, and this is where deep water gets especially unfair. Fear tends to shorten the breath. People inhale a little faster, exhale a little less fully, and begin breathing higher in the chest. On land, this is uncomfortable. In water, it can feel genuinely alarming because swimming and floating are closely tied to breath. Calm breathing helps keep the body buoyant and coordinated. Tight, shallow breathing makes the whole system feel unstable. The swimmer starts to feel as though there is less air available, even when there is plenty. The body interprets this as additional danger, which leads to more fear, which leads to worse breathing, and suddenly a perfectly ordinary patch of sea is turned into a small internal mutiny. This is why panic in water can accelerate so quickly. It is not just emotion layered on top of the environment. It is emotion changing the mechanics of how the environment is handled. A person who begins to panic may kick too hard, breathe too fast, lift the head repeatedly, waste energy, lose rhythm, and become even more convinced that the water itself is hostile. The original trigger may have been only the sight of depth, but once the body joins in, the fear starts producing its own evidence. The chest feels tight, therefore something must be wrong. The limbs feel heavier, therefore the water must be less safe than it was a minute ago. The body's attempt to prepare for danger becomes, in experience, part of the danger. Muscles respond in their own charmingly unhelpful way. Fear tends to create tension. The shoulders rise, the neck stiffens, the jaw may clench, the legs kick harder but less efficiently. The hands sometimes open and close as though they are considering whether to become useful and then thinking better of it. Tension has obvious survival value in some situations. It prepares for action. But in water, efficient movement usually depends on rhythm, looseness, and controlled effort. A tense body burns energy and feels less supported. Floating becomes harder when you're trying to do it like a person wrestling invisible furniture. Even strong swimmers notice this. Someone who is perfectly capable in a pool can suddenly feel clumsy in deep, open water once fear enters the scene. Their stroke shortens. Their breathing breaks pattern. They stop gliding and start working. The water has not changed its rules, but the body has changed its relationship to them. And because effort in water is so immediately felt, that change can be frightening in its own right. A swimmer who suddenly feels inefficient begins wondering why, and the mind, already in a suspicious mood, rarely answers gently. Then there is buoyancy, which is one of those things people trust until they stop trusting it. Under calm conditions, most swimmers understand on some level that the water will hold them up if they work with it. But fear makes that cooperation difficult. A frightened body tends to behave as though it is about to sink this very second, regardless of the actual situation. People kick more sharply, paddle more urgently, and hold themselves in ways that make floating feel less natural. It is rather like trying to rest in a hammock while convinced the hammock has developed ambitions. The feeling of the legs dangling is another small but powerful trigger. Many people with deep water fear report a sharp discomfort with having their lower body extended into unseen depth. They pull the knees up, they tread more vertically, they try, in effect, to reduce the amount of themselves that is occupying the unsettling part of the water. Rationally, this does not change much. Emotionally, it changes everything. The body is trying to gather itself back from the unknown. It wants compactness. It wants less exposure. It wants, if at all possible, to be a much smaller and less available creature. The skin becomes part of the drama as well. Fear heightens bodily awareness, so sensations that would normally be ignored begin to stand out. Water moving across the foot can feel intentional. A bit of weed brushing the ankle can produce a reaction far larger than its botanical credentials warrant. Tiny fish become sudden insults. Temperature shifts seem meaningful. Deep water often has layers of different temperature, and crossing from a warmer layer into cooler water can feel startling enough even without fear. Add an anxious mind and a body already expecting trouble, and that simple change in temperature may be interpreted as a sign that one has drifted into the jurisdiction of something ancient and disapproving. Vision changes under stress too. When people are afraid, their attention tends to lock onto certain cues while losing detail elsewhere. In water, this can mean staring into the deep below, checking it again and again, even though each glance increases distress. Or it may mean scanning the horizon for safety while losing touch with one's own breathing and movement. Some people feel disoriented because their visual system cannot settle. The surface is moving, the body is moving, the water below is unreadable. The shore may feel farther away than it is. Boats look smaller. Ladders look more important than architecture has any right to be. Fear shifts visual meaning as much as visual focus. The inner ear has its own opinion, of course. Human beings rely on balance and orientation far more than we notice in daily life. On land, the ground handles some of the work. In deep water, especially when waves are present, the body is constantly being lifted, lowered, and rotated slightly in ways that are manageable when calm but unpleasant when anxious. A fearful mind interprets this motion as instability. Up and down stop feeling simple. A swell that would have seemed almost soothing from shore now feels like the sea making decisions on your behalf. This can create a strange sense of unreality. People sometimes describe moments in deep water when everything suddenly feels a little distant, a little too sharp or oddly dreamlike. That is not because the abyss has opened a philosophical dimension. It is because fear can alter perception. The body becomes highly alert, and the mind starts processing the environment in a compressed, survival-focused way. Time may feel slower, small movements may seem exaggerated, the water may appear darker, larger, or more deliberate than it did a moment earlier. The person is not imagining the experience, but the experience is being filtered through an alarm system that is not interested in balance or nuance. Thoughts themselves change character once the body is fully involved. Fear thinking is fast, repetitive, and not especially creative in the good sense. It circles the same possibilities. What was that? Something touched me. I cannot see the bottom. I need to get back. Why did I come out this far? This is not good. None of these thoughts are poetic. None of them are wise. They are practical in the bluntest possible way. Fear strips language down to urgency. The mind stops narrating and starts issuing little internal bulletins from a newsroom that has lost all editorial restraint. One especially difficult part is how quickly the mind begins confusing possibility with certainty. A harmless sensation is no longer merely one option among many. It becomes evidence. A patch of dark water means depth, and depth means hidden things, and hidden things mean risk. And risk quickly starts masquerading as immediate threat. This chain happens with alarming speed. The body is already activated, so the mind goes looking for a reason proportionate to that activation. It finds one. The swimmer then feels frightened not only because of the original uncertainty, but because the body and mind have now formed a neat little partnership in making the worst-case scenario feel sensible. Fatigue also enters the picture sooner than people expect. Fear is tiring. A tense body burns more energy. Rapid breathing is less efficient. Poorly paced movement wears the muscles down faster. In deep water, even a mild increase in effort can feel significant, because there is no floor on which to pause and reorganize. A person who becomes afraid may tire slightly, then notice the fatigue, then treat the fatigue as proof that the fear was justified all along. Again, the body produces sensations, the mind interprets them catastrophically, and the fear deepens. That cycle explains why open water anxiety can be so much stronger than a similar fear on land. In a room, your fear may remain mostly internal. In water, it changes the terms of the situation. Your body's reaction affects breath, motion, orientation, energy use, and perceived safety all at once. That makes the fear feel self-confirming. It is not merely that you are scared, it is that being scared makes the environment feel more difficult, and the increased difficulty makes the fear feel deserved. Cold water intensifies all of this. Even moderately cool water can produce an immediate bodily response, especially if the entry is sudden. There may be a gasp, faster breathing, tighter muscles, and a brief sense of loss of control. None of this requires abyssophobia to begin with, but if a person already fears deep water, cold acts like a very unhelpful assistant. It makes the body react more sharply and gives the mind even more material to misread. A perfectly ordinary cold water shock can feel, in the first moments, like the ocean itself has become a direct opponent. Noise and silence both contribute in their own way. On the surface, waves, wind, and splashing can make it harder to judge what matters. Under the surface, sounds behave strangely. A swimmer may hear something and have no idea where it came from. Deep water already limits vision, so uncertain sound only adds to the body's sense that it cannot map the environment properly. When mapping fails, vigilance rises. This is why even a calm swim can feel mentally exhausting in a place that offers too little clear information. The mind also begins measuring distance differently. Shore seems farther, boats seem harder to reach. The amount of water around the body starts to feel less like a setting and more like an obstacle. A person may be only a short swim from safety, but fear alters that estimate. This is partly because anxious attention magnifies effort, and partly because the body has shifted from casual movement to survival monitoring. Distances that would have seemed reasonable 10 minutes earlier now feel questionable. The swimmer is no longer judging the scene from curiosity, they are judging it from alarm. One subtle change that often happens is the loss of playful thinking. In comfortable water, people notice pleasant details. Light on the surface, little fish, the feel of salt, the rhythm of strokes, the odd superiority one feels after successfully entering cold water, while others hesitate at the edge making speeches about temperature. Fear takes all of that away. The environment stops being textured and becomes simplified into what matters for safety: depth, direction, exit, unknown below. The mind becomes efficient but at the cost of ease. This is also where people sometimes become angry with themselves, which rarely improves matters. They know they should calm down. They know nothing obvious is wrong. They may even feel embarrassed, especially if others around them seem relaxed. So now there is fear plus self-criticism, which is a dreadful pairing in any setting, and especially pointless when floating in open water. The body does not calm because it has been insulted. It calms when conditions begin to feel manageable again. Harsh self-talk generally just adds another layer of tension to a system already performing far too much work. There is, however, a reason the reaction feels so total. The body and mind are not separate departments. They are one system talking very quickly. Deep water triggers the senses activate the body changes thought changes sensation. The loop closes, and within moments a person can go from mild unease to full internal certainty that this is the worst idea they have had in weeks. It can happen to experienced swimmers, to casual beachgoers, to people in lakes, oceans, cenotes, quarries, even large dark pools if the visual conditions are right. The setting changes. The loop remains recognizable. What makes this particularly fascinating is that the body is not inventing everything. Deep water really is different. It really does reduce visibility, remove stable footing, distort sound, and increase vulnerability. The fear response is not built on pure fantasy. It is built on real environmental difficulty, then amplified by uncertainty and imagination. That is why abyssophobia can feel so convincing. It is not a random terror dropped into an ordinary scene. It is an old alarm system reacting to a place where several practical concerns are already present. At the same time, the body often overshoots. It prepares as though every unknown is immediate danger. Most of the time, of course, it is not. Most deep water is simply deep water, minding its own business, holding fish, currents, and unfortunate amounts of mystery without any personal campaign against the swimmer above. But the nervous system is not in the business of waiting for perfect evidence. It is in the business of early reaction. And early reaction in the wrong place can feel overwhelming. That is why people often remember not what they saw in deep water, but what they felt. The chest tightening, the legs pulling upward, the sudden need to get out, the sense that the world below had become too large and the body above it too exposed. Those physical memories stick because fear in water is not theoretical. It is embodied. It writes itself into muscle, breath, posture, and attention. The next time the person approaches a dark drop-off or looks down from a boat into unreadable blue, the body may start responding before the mind has even finished taking in the view. And once those bodily memories exist, they do not stay politely confined to one incident. They begin to collect around images, stories, and shared language. The fear becomes easier to trigger because it has found a place not only in the nervous system, but in culture as well. We start naming the things below, imagining them, enlarging them, passing them around in stories until the physical reaction to deep water is no longer just about our own bodies. It becomes entangled with all the creatures, legends, warnings, and seaborne inventions people have used for centuries to give shape to what the dark beneath us refuses to explain. And once fear has reached the body, people do what people have always done with powerful feelings they cannot fully explain. They tell stories. They give the feeling a face, a name, a shape, a mouth, preferably an enormous one. It is one thing to say the sea is deep, dark, and difficult to understand. It is another thing entirely to say there is something in it. That second version may be less precise, but it is far easier to remember, far easier to repeat, and far better at keeping children from wandering off piers in the middle of the night. That has been true for a very long time. Long before marine biology, long before depth charts, sonar, submersibles, and documentaries, narrated by very calm people standing beside tanks full of surprisingly impolite-looking fish, the ocean was already doing what it still does best. It was vast, unpredictable, dangerous, and selective about what it revealed. Human beings, finding themselves faced with all that hiddenness, did not simply shrug and say, "Well, I suppose we shall await peer-reviewed data." They did what humans reliably do in the presence of mystery. They made meaning. They made stories. They made monsters. And in fairness, the sea practically asked for it. If you live near a forest, you hear things in the trees. If you live near mountains, weather arrives with dramatic timing, and rock does not always stay where rock is expected to stay. If you live near the sea, objects vanish, sounds travel strangely, bodies wash ashore from places no one can name, storms arrive from empty horizons, and the water keeps entire worlds hidden just below a reflective surface. This is not the sort of setting that encourages modest storytelling. It invites invention. It invites warning. It invites the sort of tale that begins with one fisherman seeing something odd in poor light and ends 3 generations later with an island-sized beast that drags ships to their doom for reasons that remain, even now, administratively unclear. That pattern appears almost everywhere people have lived beside deep water. Different cultures gave the sea different personalities, different creatures, different rules, but the basic instinct remained the same. The hidden below was not left empty, it was populated. In some traditions, the sea held serpents, vast and ancient. In others, it held giant tentacled things, lurking under the surface with a level of patience no healthy mind should admire. In others, it held spirits, guardians, tricksters, women who lured sailors with songs, men made of water, horses that rose from locks, shadowy figures seen at the edge of storms, whole living embodiments of drowning, pulling, swallowing and losing one's way. Some of these stories were clearly cautionary. Do not go too far out. Do not trust calm water. Do not mock the sea. Do not sail in bad weather. Do not swim where the depth changes suddenly. The stories put skin and teeth on danger. A current becomes a hand. A whirlpool becomes a mouth. A hidden reef becomes the work of an offended creature below. The modern mind likes to separate myth from function, as though old stories were only decorative nonsense attached to a harder practical world. But often the practical world was right there inside the myth. People understood perfectly well that water could kill. The story simply made that truth memorable. Think of the Kraken, for example, the great northern sea beast said to rise from the depths and drag vessels under. Now, did sailors literally encounter a mythic monster of impossible size waiting beneath every voyage? Almost certainly not. But did they encounter enormous squid, strange floating masses, sudden swells, storms, misjudged shadows, and the unnerving fact that the sea can produce sights no one on land would believe by morning? Very likely. Add exhaustion, darkness, fear, and the tendency of all human retellings to improve with each repetition, and you have the beginnings of a legend sturdy enough to last centuries. Or take Leviathan, that colossal sea being made into a symbol of overwhelming power, chaos, and danger in ancient traditions. Whether understood as creature, metaphor, or some impressive combination of the two, it speaks to the same human recognition. The deep feels large enough to contain something beyond ordinary scale, not because we have evidence of such a thing gliding beneath every ship, but because the ocean itself already exceeds ordinary comfort. Once the environment is vast enough, the imagination begins matching it with inhabitants of proportionate size. A shallow pond does not inspire Leviathan. A black, seemingly endless sea absolutely does. Then there are the creatures that were not always giant, but were somehow worse for being nearer to human shape. Sirens, mermaids in their darker forms, selkies in some traditions, drowned women, shore spirits, calling voices in fog. These stories reveal another side of sea fear. Not everything terrifying about water is brute force. Some of it is seduction, disorientation, temptation. The sea does not only crush and swallow, it invites, then alters the terms. Sailors hear a sound, a swimmer follows a light, a person steps farther than they should. Water can be dangerous through force, but also through misjudgment, and myths notice that early. Rivers, lakes and marshes develop their own cast of beings too. Kelpies in Scottish lore, shape-shifting waterhorses luring riders to their deaths, nixies in parts of Europe, spirits of alluring and dangerous water, Taniwha in Maori traditions, powerful beings associated in some tellings with rivers, caves, deep pools and the sea, sometimes protective, sometimes dangerous, always to be respected. In Japan, stories of sea spirits and figures like umibozu emerge from darkness and storms, the water itself turning strange and inhabited. The details vary, but the pattern remains faithful to the feeling. Dark water is not left as dark water. It acquires character. That is an important word here, character. Myths do not merely add creatures to the sea. They give the sea motives. It becomes angry, hungry, jealous, offended, lonely, deceptive, sacred, punishing, or watchful. A storm is not only weather, it is a response. A disappearance is not merely bad luck, it is taking. This does not happen because old people were foolish, and modern people are not. Modern people do exactly the same thing, only with better cameras and worse comment sections. We still say the sea swallowed a ship. We still say the ocean gave something back. We still talk as if water acts. At some level, our minds remain very willing to treat natural force like personality. That willingness matters because personality is easier to fear than physics. Physics is cold and difficult and never once apologized for existing. Personality, by contrast, gives fear a target. It is much easier to imagine an angry beast below the boat than to sit comfortably with pressure systems, underwater topography, current gradients, and the simple fact that human beings cannot see very far through dark, moving water. The monster is emotionally efficient. It organizes all the unease in one place. It says, "This is why the sea feels wrong. There is something in it." And every now and then, the sea offered just enough evidence to keep the stories alive. A carcass washes ashore in an altered state, half decayed, stretched, swollen, difficult to identify. A giant squid turns up where few have seen one before. A whale surfaces beside a small vessel with enough sudden size to rearrange someone's philosophy for the rest of the week. Strange fish are hauled from deep trawls, all teeth and loose opinions. Lights appear in fog, sounds carry oddly over water at night, entire ships vanish in storms, leaving wreckage or none at all. People do not need much. Give them a few real mysteries and they will produce generations of excellent overcorrection. That overcorrection is not only fear, it is also respect. Sea myths often carry a clear emotional message beneath the dramatic details. You are not in charge here. Do not confuse access with mastery. Just because you can stand on a deck or paddle over a bay or launch a vessel into open water does not mean the sea has agreed to become simple for your convenience. That lesson appears again and again. Pride goes out. Humility returns, if it returns at all. The water keeps its own terms. Sailors especially have long lived in the space between practical skill and superstition, which makes perfect sense. Life at sea rewards competence and punishes carelessness. But it also exposes people to so much uncertainty that ritual becomes irresistible. Lucky objects, forbidden words, taboos, omens, habits, small repeated gestures. This is not because seafarers were uniquely irrational. It is because unpredictability makes ritual comforting. When a person cannot control the weather, the currents, the depth, or what lies below the hull, they become very interested in any action that feels like it might improve the relationship. Human beings are like that everywhere, but the ocean gives the habit excellent working conditions. Even now, modern people who would never admit to believing in sea monsters still behave as though the old stories left a residue. A patch of very dark water on a map becomes instantly unnerving. Underwater footage from deep trenches attracts comments that read like collective confessions. The silhouette of a whale beneath a paddleboard alarms people who know perfectly well that whales are not generally in the business of collecting paddleboarders. Large submerged structures, shipwrecks, anchor chains disappearing into black water, underwater caves, the open mouth of a flooded sinkhole, all of these produce that same old reaction. The language may be different now. We call it eerie, cursed, nightmare fuel. Absolutely not. But the emotional structure is ancient. The sea still feels like a place that can hold more than we want it to. One reason myths continue to work on us is that the deep ocean really does contain creatures that seem to have skipped the step where they were meant to become visually reassuring. Nature, in the deep sea, is under no pressure to be pretty in the way surface dwellers prefer. It is under pressure to survive in cold, darkness and scarcity. The results can be memorable. Bioluminescent hunters, transparent-headed fish, eels that look halfway assembled, squid with proportions that seem personally disrespectful, crabs around hydrothermal vents in places where no sunlight reaches, giant isopods looking like the sea commissioned a woodlouse and then forgot to stop. None of these are mythic beasts in the old sense, but they keep one crucial idea alive. The ocean hides life unlike the life we know best. That matters enormously to the imagination. Once people understand that truly strange beings exist in the deep, the old legends no longer feel purely childish. Exaggerated, yes. Symbolic. Often. But not baseless in the emotional sense. The sea really does hold unfamiliar forms. It really does conceal size. It really does produce encounters that seem unbelievable until a camera or net proves otherwise. The imagination sees that and says, "Thank you, I will now behave much worse." There is also something socially useful about sharing monster stories. Fear becomes easier to carry when it is communal. If one person says the water felt wrong, that is only private unease. If a whole culture says there is a thing in the bay, or a spirit in the channel, or a serpent beyond the reef, then the feeling has structure. It has language. It can be taught, repeated, inherited. Communities often use such stories to mark dangerous places. This cove is bad in winter. That channel has strong currents. Those rocks vanish at high tide. Rather than print laminated safety notices and install railings, earlier people often wrap the warning in a being. Ignore the place, and the being ignores you. Enter carelessly and you become part of the lesson. Children understand this instinctively. They do not need a lecture on hydraulic dynamics to avoid a black pond after dark. Tell them there is something there, and they will remember. Adults are much the same, only with better vocabulary and worse confidence. We pretend we have moved beyond myth, but when confronted with open black water under a moonless sky, most people become remarkably willing to believe in almost anything for at least 30 seconds. And the sea at night does more than almost any setting to preserve this old habit. During the day, horizon, light, distance, and surface texture keep the world roughly organised. At night, all that collapses. The water turns into black extension. Depth becomes invisible in a new way. The line between surface and distance blurs. Sounds carry from nowhere obvious. Lights appear isolated. This is fertile ground for stories. It always has been. A sailor on a dark watch hears a splash beside the hull, sees a brief pale shape, catches movement in the swell, and by dawn he has met something no one on shore can fully dismiss because no one on shore was there. Fog does similar work. So do storms. So do lonely coastlines and half-seen breakers over unseen rock. The sea creates partial information so generously that myth is almost a natural byproduct. Human beings do not thrive on partial information. We complete it. We animate it. We assign intentions, faces, and histories. The ocean, by refusing to explain itself fully, has inspired centuries of perfectly understandable overinterpretation. What is interesting, though, is that the stories are rarely only about creatures. They are about human limits. A sea monster is often just danger given a spine and a biography. A seductive water spirit is often just misjudgment with better hair. A devouring maw in the deep is often the feeling of scale made literal. A giant hand dragging ships under is often storm, current, and structural failure translated into one unforgettable image. Myth is not ignorance painted brightly. It is emotion organised into narrative. That is why these stories still matter when talking about abyssophobia. The fear of the abyss is not only fear of water, depth, or drowning. It is also fear shaped by culture. We inherit a long gallery of things the sea may contain. Even if we do not consciously believe in them, they influence the mood of the unknown. Deep water is not blank in the modern imagination. It is crowded with echoes. Kraken, leviathan, sirens, ghost ships, vanished divers, wrecks lying upright in the dark, giant shadows beneath the hull, lights moving under black water where no lights should be. We carry all of that with us when we look down into blue, and yet the truth is almost more unsettling than the monsters in one specific way. The sea does not need them. It never did. The stories helped us speak about fear, helped us remember danger, helped us respect places that could not be controlled. But the water itself remained fully capable of overwhelming us without any serpent, spirit, or impossible beast doing a single thing. The myths gave shape to the terror. They were not required to create it, which is why the next step in this journey is perhaps the most sobering one. Because once we strip away the folklore, the sea does not become small, familiar, or harmless. It becomes measurable, yes. It becomes charted in parts, filmed in parts, named in parts. But it also becomes real in a way that can be even harder to dismiss, because beneath all the monsters and stories is a fact simple enough to need no embellishment at all. The abyss exists, and it is very, very large. And when we strip away the monsters, the old names, the ghost stories told on docks and under blankets and in cabins that creak at night, the ocean does not become smaller. That is the uncomfortable part. The legends may fade, but the scale remains. In some ways, it becomes more unsettling, not less, because what is left behind is not a dramatic creature with motives and a memorable silhouette. What is left is measurement, distance, pressure, cold, depth. A planet that is, by any honest standard, still mostly water, and a human animal trying very hard to feel confident while floating on top of it. The abyss is real. It is not just a mood we project into dark water. It is not merely the mind turning uncertainty into atmosphere. There are places in the ocean where the seafloor drops to depths so immense that ordinary human intuition stops being useful. The numbers can be spoken, written, repeated, and still fail to land properly. We hear them, but we do not feel them. That may be because human beings are quite good with distances they can imagine in bodily terms. A room, a house, a field, a road, a mountain, even an airplane flight, unpleasant though it may be for those trapped beside a man who has decided the armrest is a moral suggestion. But depth in the open ocean exceeds that easy sense of scale. You can say that the average ocean depth is measured in kilometres, and the mind nods politely without understanding much. You can say that some trenches run far deeper still, and the mind says yes, very interesting, while quietly failing to build a picture that means anything. We are not equipped to feel large depths properly. We are equipped to be alarmed by them. That is worth noticing, because one reason the abyss frightens people so effectively is that it is not merely hidden. It is enormous in a way that remains difficult to domesticate. A dark cellar is unsettling because it is concealed. A cave can be unsettling because it is enclosed and unknown. But the abyss adds another ingredient. It is hidden and vast at the same time. That combination is difficult for the nervous system to absorb calmly. Hidden things are bad enough. Hidden things on a scale too large to picture are far worse. Consider the simple fact that if you stand at the shore and look out over the sea, what you're seeing is almost nothing of the total structure beneath that surface. That sounds obvious, but obvious things can still feel strange when you sit with them properly. The surface is only a skin. Beneath it are layers of water, changes in temperature, changes in light, changes in pressure, changes in current, then eventually the deep sea floor itself, and beyond that trenches, ridges, plains, slopes, canyons, mountains, volcanoes, fractures, and geological features vast enough to make landscapes on land look almost tidy. That's another deeply unsettling detail. People often imagine the deep ocean as a simple emptiness, a vertical drop leading to a smooth floor. But the abyss is not smooth in any comforting sense. It has terrain, it has structure, it has relief. There are underwater mountain ranges longer than many countries. There are trenches deep enough to humble language. There are broad abyssal plains stretching in darkness for absurd distances. There are hydrothermal vent fields, steep escarpments, submarine canyons, seamounts rising from the seafloor like drowned peaks. And all of this exists in a realm where sunlight does not reach, where pressure grows immense, and where human beings survive only through technology so complicated it feels almost argumentative. That last part matters. We do not casually visit the abyss. We visit it the way one might visit the surface of another planet, inside machines built with enormous care by people who have correctly identified that being crushed by the ocean is best avoided. Even our most advanced encounters with deep water are indirect, partial, expensive, and difficult. That alone tells us something important. The abyss is not merely deep in the recreational sense. It is deep in that you need engineering, planning, and a very serious attitude toward material science sense. And because direct experience is so limited, most people know the abyss only through fragments. A camera lowered into darkness, a submersible window looking onto black water and suspended particles, a map coloured in blues so dark they seem to absorb thought, a documentary narrator speaking in a measured voice while behind them some unfortunate fish appears, as though nature became briefly experimental. These fragments are enough to suggest scale, but they still do not quite convert it into feeling. The abyss remains one of those realities that we can know and yet never fully grasp. Perhaps that is why even stable, factual descriptions of the deep can sound strangely unreal. Sunlight fades quickly in water. Below a certain depth, the ocean becomes dim, then dark, then permanently dark. Pressure increases constantly with descent. Temperature drops. Life changes. The human body, unaided, cannot belong there, and still the water continues downward, not to a romantic symbolic darkness, to actual darkness, not to a metaphorical pressure, to crushing pressure. The abyss is not eerie because we have given it language. It is eerie because the conditions are so physically final. There is something especially sobering about the abyssal plain, that enormous deep ocean floor stretching under black water. It sounds flat, which ought to make it less dramatic, but it does not. If anything, the thought of a vast level seafloor in total darkness feels even stranger. A plain is usually something visible, open, touched by weather and sky. An abyssal plain is a plain no eye naturally belongs in, a broad landscape under crushing water, where the nearest comparison from daily life is essentially none. The human mind likes analogy. It wants to say it is like this or like that. The abyss keeps resisting the comparison. And then there are trenches which feel almost rude in their existence. It is one thing for the ocean to be deep. It is another thing for parts of it to be dramatically deeper than the already deep parts around them, as though the planet occasionally lost patience and folded downward. Ocean trenches are not the sort of features one would invent to make nervous swimmers feel better. They are long, narrow depressions where one tectonic plate slides beneath another, and they descend into the Earth's crust under miles of water. You can read about the Mariana Trench, hear that it reaches nearly 11 kilometers at its deepest known point, and the information still slides off ordinary intuition. 11 kilometers downward is not a human distance. It is the sort of number that makes the body respond with a flat internal no. Even when we move away from the deepest trench and speak only of the deep ocean in general, the scale remains excessive by normal standards. Once you leave the bright upper world of surface waters and descend beyond where sunlight meaningfully helps, you are entering a place where the planet continues without us, in a form we were not built to negotiate. That is the central discomfort. The abyss is not empty in the way a room can be empty. It is full of conditions. It is full of pressure, geography, chemistry, movement, cold, and forms of life adapted to all of that. It is busy being itself, with no reference to our comfort. This is where reality becomes more unnerving than myth in a very specific way. A monster can at least be imagined as rare. A sea serpent may or may not be there. A giant mouth may or may not rise from below. But depth itself is always there. If you are over deep ocean, then beneath you is the entire column of water and whatever terrain lies below it, whether you think about it or not. The abyss does not depend on being seen to exist. It simply is. That can produce a peculiar kind of dread, because dread often feeds best on things that do not require performance. The abyss is not trying to be frightening. It is just operating on a scale that makes human beings feel temporary and badly designed for the venue. There is also the issue of time. The deep sea feels old, and in an important sense it is. Not old in a mystical storytelling way, just old in the geological and biological sense. The processes that shape it unfold over immense stretches. Sediment settles, plates move, vents form, mountains rise and erode underwater. Species adapt to darkness over evolutionary time. Meanwhile, human life, with all its deadlines and errands and feelings about email, looks very brief indeed. Standing beside the sea is one thing. Thinking seriously about what lies under it can produce the odd sense that the world below has been carrying on for ages without ever needing us to understand it. This is probably why maps of the ocean floor can be so disturbing even when they are just maps. They reduce the sea to contour, depth and shape, and yet instead of making it cosy, they often make it worse. A chart showing a continental shelf dropping into deeper basin, then into darker bands of depth, then into trench, does not necessarily reassure. It reveals how little of the ocean matches the shallow, beach-like image people often carry around. The pleasant holiday sea near shore is not the dominant reality of the ocean. It is the edge condition. The main body of the world's oceans is deep and much of it is dark. That is a difficult shift for the mind. We like to think of the ocean as what we meet from the beach. Waves, foam, bright water, the occasional gull behaving as though it pays rent. But the beach is only where land and sea briefly negotiate. The true scale of the ocean lies outward and downward. The further you go from shore, the less the environment resembles the friendly version sold on postcards. The shelf ends, the bottom falls, the colour deepens, the world below opens. The abyss was not added later to make things dramatic. It was there all along. Even more unsettling is the fact that open, deep water can sit surprisingly near places people treat as ordinary. A coastline may look cheerful enough, all cliffs and bright shallows and people carrying sandwiches. While not terribly far offshore, the seafloor may already be dropping into something much larger and darker than the view from land suggests. This disconnect matters. It means the abyss is not some separate fantasy zone reached only after weeks at sea. In many parts of the world, serious depth begins closer than the nervous system would prefer, and then there is pressure, which remains one of the least intuitive features of the deep. We're used to gravity because gravity announces itself constantly. Pressure in the deep sea is harder to feel imaginatively because we do not survive there to feel it, yet it is one of the defining facts of the abyss. As you descend, the weight of all that water above increases relentlessly. It does not negotiate. It does not get bored. It simply grows. At abyssal depths, the pressure is immense, enough that every object, every living body, every piece of machinery has to exist on very specific terms. That is not the atmosphere of a place where human instincts naturally settle down. Darkness behaves differently there too. Surface darkness, even at night, usually contains familiar cues: moonlight, stars, street glow from somewhere regrettably modern. In the deep ocean there is darkness of another kind. Darkness not because the lights are off for the evening, but because sunlight simply does not reach. Day and night mean less. The upper world continues, weather shifts, cities hum, people argue about parking and passwords, and far below, in permanent dark, the abyss remains the abyss. That separation between the everyday world and the deep can feel eerie in a way that is hard to overstate. It is all one planet, and yet it may as well be two. Still, what makes the abyss especially powerful in the imagination is that it combines all of this with visual absence. If the deep ocean were laid out before us like a mountain valley under clear daylight, perhaps it would feel grand but manageable. We would trace edges, we would understand slopes, we would become familiar with landmarks. But the abyss is not offered that way. It is covered, hidden, seen in pieces through instruments, through lights, through small windows and narrow beams. Its vastness is inseparable from its concealment. We're dealing not only with bigness, but with bigness withheld. That has emotional consequences. A known large thing can be impressive. An unseen large thing tends to be disturbing. A mountain above ground makes itself available to the eye. The abyss does not. You may know that a mountain range underwater exists, but you do not stand there and take it in with a flask of tea and a practical coat. You know it through data, through sonar, through images assembled by machines. Knowledge arrives without the ease of normal seeing, and because normal seeing never fully occurs, the emotional brain keeps a little of its suspicion intact. This is where the deep sea begins to feel almost unfairly designed to trouble us. It is vast enough to exceed intuition, hidden enough to starve perception, real enough to dismiss fantasy, and hostile enough to justify caution. Very few environments gather all of that at once. A desert may be vast, but at least it can usually be seen. A cave may be hidden, but it is not continent-wide. A mountain may be dangerous, but gravity remains visible in a very straightforward way. The abyss combines scale, concealment, indifference, and physical hostility into one setting. No wonder the human mind treats it as special, and yet there is another aspect of its reality that unnerves people just as much as the depth itself, perhaps more. Because once we accept that the abyss is not imagined, that the darkness and pressure and impossible distances are really there, another question follows naturally. What exactly belongs in a place like that? What lives there? What moves there? What counts as normal in a world where sunlight fails and pressure rules? The fear begins with water and scale, but it quickly shifts toward classification. We want names, we want categories. We want to know whether what unsettles us has one label or several. That is why people eventually begin sorting their fear, trying to understand whether they are afraid of open water in general, of depth in particular, of what cannot be seen beneath them, or of the whole unpleasant bundle together. And that is where this next part begins to take shape. Because once the abyss becomes real in the mind, the fear starts asking to be called by its proper names. And once the fear begins asking for a proper name, things become a little clearer, though not necessarily more comfortable. Human beings like naming things. We do it partly for science, partly for order, and partly because a problem with a label feels just slightly less slippery than a problem without one. A nameless fear can seem to spread everywhere. A named fear, even a very unpleasant one, can at least be pointed to. You can say, this is what I'm dealing with. Not ideal, certainly, but better than standing on a boat ladder at dusk thinking, I appear to be losing an argument with the Atlantic for reasons I cannot fully explain. So let us sort the names out gently, because they are often mixed together and for good reason. Abyssophobia is usually understood as a fear of great depths, especially dark, immense, downward spaces. It is the fear that rises when the bottom disappears, when the water beneath you stops looking like water and starts looking like an opening. Thalassophobia is broader. It is often described as a fear of deep bodies of water or the ocean itself, especially vast open water, the sea's scale, its hidden life, and the feeling of being small and exposed within it. The two overlap so neatly that many people who speak of one are really describing both. That overlap matters. A person may say they fear the ocean, but what they really mean is that they fear what happens when the ocean turns unreadable. Another person may say they fear depth, but what they really mean is that the depth becomes frightening because it belongs to a large body of water that feels impossible to fully inspect. Some fear the drop, some fear the vastness, some fear what may be living below, some fear drowning, currents, distance from shore, or the idea of being surrounded by a volume that continues in all directions they would rather not think about. And most of the time, these are not cleanly separated. They travel together like a rather unfriendly committee. This is why people often struggle to explain exactly what about the sea frightens them. If you ask someone whether they are afraid of sharks, they may say no, not exactly. If you ask whether they are afraid of drowning, they may say of course, but that is not the whole thing either. If you ask whether they dislike not seeing the bottom, they may react with the force of recognition that arrives when someone has finally pointed to the correct wire. Because for many people, the problem is not simply water, nor even danger in the straightforward sense. It is concealment. It is the uneasy relationship between space and sight. It is the fact that in deep water, what you cannot see often feels more powerful than what you can. That is a very old kind of fear. Human beings are not especially good at leaving empty spaces empty. If a field disappears into fog, the mind starts wandering. If a stairwell descends into darkness, the body becomes more careful. If a room is silent and the door is half open, we become very interested in the half we cannot inspect. Water intensifies all of that because it is not only hidden, but alive with movement, depth, and possibility. It shifts, it reflects, it distorts, it withholds. A dark hallway is one thing. A dark ocean is a hallway with no visible walls, no visible floor, and the additional social difficulty of containing fish. This is where the fear of what we cannot see becomes the common thread tying everything together. Whether a person calls it abyssophobia, thalassophobia, or simply an unshakable dislike of dark open water, the experience often centers on invisible information. The body wants to know what is beneath it. The eyes cannot provide a satisfying answer. The mind begins supplying one anyway. That is the core mechanism. The unseen is rarely experienced as neutral for long. It becomes loaded. A hidden thing in water is not merely hidden. It becomes potentially large, potentially moving, and potentially important in exactly the wrong way. There is an interesting difference, though, between fearing what cannot be seen and fearing what is imagined. The two are related but not identical. Some people are disturbed by deep water even when they are not picturing a specific threat at all. They do not see a shark in their mind or a squid or anything with a mouth. They are simply made uneasy by the fact that so much lies below them without their consent or inspection. That discomfort is not childish or fanciful. It is a response to unreadable space. The fear arrives before the creature. The creature, if it appears in the imagination at all, often comes later as the mind's attempt to explain why the body has become so alert. Others experience the reverse. The fear is immediate because they do imagine something specific. They think of sharks, jellyfish, giant fish, submerged wreckage, a body of some kind, a sudden hand, an eye opening in the deep, or even a perfectly ordinary animal made terrifying by the conditions in which it appears. Again, this is not always about rational likelihood. It is about how fear behaves when given missing information. The hidden space becomes a stage, and the mind begins casting roles. In practice, of course, abyssophobia and thalassophobia tend to blur. A person may feel calm at the beach, comfortable on the sand, even willing to wade in happily up to the point where the water reaches the waist and the bottom remains visible. Then the floor vanishes into darker blue and the whole mood changes. Is that fear of depth? Yes. Is it fear of the sea? Also yes. Is it fear of what might be swimming below? Possibly. Is it fear of being in a place where support, sight and certainty all weaken at once? Very much so. The label helps, but the experience itself is messier than a neat definition. There is also a reason some people feel one fear more strongly than the other. A person can fear the vastness of the ocean without being especially disturbed by vertical depth. They may dislike being far from shore, surrounded by open water, unable to see land, aware that beneath the boat is a huge moving body with a scale they cannot emotionally manage. That leans toward thalassophobia. Another person might feel fine on a ship crossing open sea as long as they are not looking into the water itself. But the instant they are asked to float over a deep drop-off, peer down from a pier into black water, or swim above a submerged trench where the seafloor disappears, the body revolts. That leans more toward abyssophobia. Different arrangements of the same basic discomfort. Different angles on the same old problem. The fear of what cannot be seen has another peculiarity. It often feels far more convincing than fear of what can. A visible danger can be assessed, a large wave can be judged, a rocky shoreline can be avoided. Even a visible shark, while not a situation one would choose to improve an afternoon, has a certain terrible clarity to it. You know what the problem is. But invisible danger has no edges. It expands to fill the available uncertainty. The mind keeps circling it, because it has not been given enough information to stop. In that sense, unseen fear is often harder to calm than seen fear. The imagination remains employed. That employment can become exhausting. Many people who fear deep water describe a very specific mental rhythm. They look down, they feel uneasy, they look away. Then they feel compelled to look down again, as though the next glance might finally settle it. It never does. Or they avoid looking altogether, which is also difficult because refusing to look creates its own suspense. The mind starts building possibilities behind the curtain. Either way, attention becomes trapped between inspection and avoidance. It is a tiring place to be, and one reason these fears can feel so consuming, even in situations that appear, from the outside, rather calm. Images trigger this beautifully, which tells us a great deal. A photograph of a swimmer floating over a dark blue drop-off, a drone shot of a tiny boat over almost black water, a diver suspended above a sinkhole, a ladder descending from a platform into a lake where the lower rungs vanish into darkness. None of these images are actual threats to the viewer. The viewer is dry, comfortable, perhaps eating toast, perhaps wearing slippers of no particular maritime relevance. And yet the body may still react. Why? Because the trigger is not only practical danger, it is visual unreadability. The image suggests unsupported space and hidden depth. That is enough to wake the system. This is also why underwater structures can be so upsetting. Submerged statues, wrecks, chains, pipes, platforms, ladders, cages, even harmless objects can become deeply unsettling when partially visible in dark water. They provide just enough information to make the hidden space feel occupied, but not enough to make it feel understood. A shipwreck resting upright below, disappearing into murk, can be more disturbing than open water, because now the mind knows something is there and still cannot fully see it. The unseen has acquired form without becoming manageable. Quite honestly, it is difficult to think of a less generous arrangement. The difference between fear and phobia is worth touching on here too, though gently, because not every person who dislikes deep water has a clinical phobia. Plenty of people are uneasy around dark open water in ways that make sense and do not interfere much with daily life. They avoid swimming too far out. They dislike looking into very deep water. They prefer beaches with clear shallows and an obvious bottom. That may simply be caution or a strong preference. A phobia, in the more formal sense, tends to be more intense, more persistent, and more disruptive. It causes significant distress, avoidance, or physical panic out of proportion to the actual situation. But out in the lived world, these distinctions are not always tidy. People do not usually announce, "I am now experiencing a clinically meaningful fear response with moderate ocean-specific imagery." They say, "No thank you, absolutely not, get me out of this water," and fair enough. There is something else hidden inside these labels, which is the question of control. Fear of what cannot be seen is often also fear of what cannot be controlled. On land, we depend heavily on inspection to maintain calm. We check the road, we check the room, we check the path ahead. Vision allows prediction, and prediction allows a sense of control. Deep water weakens that system. You cannot inspect the whole scene. You cannot tell what is below, how far below, whether it is moving, or how quickly conditions may change. Once vision loses authority, control feels weaker too. The body notices immediately. This may be why some people feel uneasy not only in the ocean, but in any large body of dark or murky water. Lakes, reservoirs, quarries, flooded caves, even large swimming pools at night can produce a milder version of the same response. The common factor is not always the ocean itself. It is the combination of depth, hiddenness, and exposure. A quarry with still, black water can feel every bit as wrong as a cove at dusk. A reservoir with steep sides and no visible bottom may produce the same internal recoil as a boat drifting over deeper sea. The labels help point us toward patterns, but the nervous system is less interested in terminology than in cues. It is also true that the unseen below us does not need to be dangerous to feel intolerable. This is one of the more revealing details. People are often frightened by perfectly harmless things in deep water, simply because those things emerge from a hidden environment. A large fish gliding below, a sea turtle rising suddenly, a submerged log in a lake. Even a patch of darker weed can produce a genuine jolt. The fear does not wait for proof of harm. It reacts to surprise from below. It reacts to the hidden becoming visible too late. The real offence, as far as the nervous system is concerned, is that something was there without filing the proper paperwork. The body's relationship to visibility is almost embarrassingly simple in this regard. If it can see what is around it, it is calmer. If it cannot, it becomes cautious. If something appears suddenly out of that unseen zone, it becomes alarmed. This is not sophisticated, but it is reliable, and in deep water, where visibility is often partial by design, the system remains primed for interruption. That priming itself can become the fear. A person is not always terrified of any one thing. They are terrified of being interrupted by something from a place they cannot monitor. All of this helps explain why so many people find underwater darkness worse than nighttime darkness on land. Darkness on land at least belongs to a familiar space. Floors remain floors, walls remain walls, roads remain where roads were, though one hopes. In water, darkness removes not only light but structure. It is one thing to enter a dark room and know the furniture is still where you left it. It is another thing entirely to look into black water and understand that whatever structure exists below is unavailable to you, and that the volume around it may be far larger than your mind is willing to picture calmly. And once a person realizes this fear is bound to invisibility itself, a strange thing can happen. The ocean begins to feel personal, not because it is actually singling anyone out, but because the hidden below seems aimed directly at the self. The unseen becomes your unseen. The risk feels tailored to your body. The dark beneath is no longer just a general condition of the world. It is a private discomfort pressing up against your awareness. That is one reason these fears can feel so intimate and hard to explain. They do not always sound dramatic when described out loud, but inside the body, they are felt with surprising force. So yes, abyssophobia and thalassophobia are useful names. They help us sort whether we fear the drop, the vastness, the hidden life, the open water, the unseen below, or the whole deeply impolite package together. But underneath the labels, the emotional engine is often the same. We are creatures who depend on sight and footing. Deep water removes both. We like scale we can judge and spaces we can inspect. The ocean offers neither once it deepens. We cope by naming the fear, defining it, breaking it into terms that seem manageable. Yet the reason the names matter is not that they solve the feeling. It is that they reveal what the feeling has been doing all along. It has been taking the hidden personally, and that, more than the scientific label or the technical definition, may be why the deep unsettles so many people so completely. The ocean is large in an objective sense, yes. It is dark in a measurable sense, yes. It contains depth, current, life, pressure, and distance beyond ordinary comfort. But for the person floating above it or staring into it from a pier, the experience is not only factual, it lands inside the body as something direct. The fear does not stay out there in the water. It comes inward. It starts to feel tied to memory, imagination, vulnerability, and self in a way that makes the whole thing less like a general hazard and more like a very private confrontation. And that may be the strangest part of all, because for something so enormous, so impersonal, so entirely uninterested in our individual schedules, plans, and small domestic concerns, the deep has a way of feeling oddly personal the moment we are near it. Not personal in the sense that the ocean has chosen us, of course. The sea is far too busy being the sea for that sort of targeted emotional management. But personal in the way fear often becomes personal. It slips past the general facts of a place and settles directly into the body. It stops being about water in the broad sense and becomes about me in this water, my skin in this cold, my breath in this chest, my legs in that unseen space below. That is why two people can look at the same patch of ocean and feel entirely different things. One sees beauty, freedom, a pleasant stretch of blue worth swimming through before lunch. The other sees distance, hidden depth, and a setting in which several deeply important variables have become unavailable all at once. Neither person is inventing the sea. They are simply meeting it through different nervous systems, and for the person who feels the deep personally, that encounter is rarely philosophical. It is immediate. It is bodily. It is not a grand meditation on human limits, though those may arrive later when one is dry and back on land and able to hold a cup properly. In the moment, it is much simpler. It is the sense that this place has reached in and found exactly the parts of you that dislike uncertainty most. Part of that comes from the fact that deep water does not remain outside you. A mountain can intimidate from a distance. A storm can be watched from a window. Even a forest at night can be approached and then left behind with relative ease if one chooses not to have that sort of evening. Water is different. The moment you enter it, the environment becomes contact. It is on the skin, in the ears, around the limbs, under the body, resisting every motion, holding you up while also reminding you that being held up by water is a conditional arrangement. The fear, therefore, feels less like observing danger and more like being involved in it. The sea is not over there. It is touching you. That alone changes the emotional quality of the experience. Human beings are generally much calmer with things they can observe at a distance than with things that physically surround them. You can stand at the edge of a dark lake and feel uneasy. Step into that same lake until the water reaches your chest, and the unease acquires a different tone. Float in it once the bottom is gone, and now the environment is not merely around you but beneath you in a way that feels deeply specific. It is not a general risk anymore. It is a direct arrangement between your body and a volume of hidden space. There is also the matter of exposure, which is always personal whether we like it or not. A person in deep water often feels not just small, but revealed. Again, not literally observed, though the imagination enjoys making that suggestion almost immediately, but exposed in the more basic sense. The body is unsupported, visible at the surface, limited in movement, dependent on calm and coordination, and surrounded by an environment that can conceal far more than it shows. That creates a very unflattering power imbalance. On land, even in risky settings, we're used to having options. We can crouch, run, grab something, brace, climb, step back, re-evaluate. In deep water, those options thin out quickly. You can swim, you can float, you can get out if there is a place nearby to get out. Beyond that, the body becomes acutely aware that this is not its best medium, and when the body becomes that aware, the fear naturally starts feeling intimate. It is tied to breathing. It is tied to strength. It is tied to whether the muscles remain steady and the rhythm remains under control. A fear tied to your own breath will always feel personal. A fear tied to whether you can keep your chest calm, your limbs efficient, your head clear, is never going to sit politely at the edge of awareness. It comes right up close. It starts behaving like a direct comment on your survival, and survival is about as personal as the mind gets. Memory adds even more force to this. Many deep fears are not just reactions to the present scene, they are reactions to the present plus every earlier moment that felt similar. Maybe the first time someone lost sight of the bottom, they felt that sharp twist in the stomach and never quite forgot it. Maybe they were caught unexpectedly in deeper water as a child and still remember the helpless little shock of the floor not being where the floor was expected to be. Maybe they swallowed water once while panicking, and their body has never fully trusted open water since. The present ocean then arrives already carrying old material. The fear does not feel generic because it is not generic. It is threaded through remembered sensation. This is why people often struggle to explain their fear without sounding, to themselves, somehow overly dramatic. They say things like, "I don't know, it just feels wrong," or "I hate the idea of something under me," or "I can't stand not seeing the bottom." Those are not poor explanations. They are honest ones. The fear resists neat language because it is bound up with bodily experience more than with clear concepts. A person may know perfectly well that there is probably nothing threatening in the water below, and still the body says yes, but there is still water below, and you still cannot see through enough of it, and your feet are still not on anything I would personally describe as dependable. There is another reason the deep feels personal, and it has to do with imagination using the self as its main reference point. Fear does not usually imagine disaster in the abstract. It imagines disaster happening to me, not to a swimmer, not to a person in general, to me with my exact body at this exact distance from shore, with my exact ability to stay calm, my exact uncertainty about what touched my leg, my exact discomfort with the colour the water has just become. Fear is a deeply self-centred storyteller. In ordinary life, this can be annoying. In deep water, it becomes almost inevitable. The hidden below is measured against one's own vulnerability, and that makes the whole scene feel targeted even when it is not. This self-reference grows stronger the longer a person remains in the water once unease has begun. At first, the thought may be simple. I don't like this. Then it becomes, I am too far out. Then my breathing feels wrong. Then my legs feel too exposed. Then, why did I come this far? Then I need to get back. Notice how quickly the internal language gathers itself around the first person. The ocean does not become more emotional. The mind does. The deep works like a pressure chamber for self-awareness. It narrows attention until body, fear, and environment all seem fused into one immediate problem. And that narrowing has an odd side effect. It can make the sea feel as though it somehow knows where to press. Again, not because the sea has motives, but because the environment happens to challenge several human weaknesses at once. We rely on sight. The deep removes it. We like footing. The deep removes that too. We like knowing the size of the space we are in. The deep refuses to offer a manageable answer. We like control over breathing and movement. The deep makes those feel suddenly negotiable. We like quick exits. The deep tends to put the exit somewhere behind us. All of this combines so neatly that a person may feel almost singled out by the situation, as though the place has been designed with an unnerving understanding of exactly what will unsettle a human nervous system. It is no wonder, then, that the emotional tone of deep water fear often includes shame or defensiveness. People do not usually feel ashamed of being cautious about a cliff edge or a storm. Those dangers are obvious, public, respectable. But with deep water, especially when others nearby seem calm, the fear can feel private in a less flattering way. Why am I reacting like this when everyone else is floating about as if the abyss were a perfectly normal place to spend an afternoon? Why does that patch of dark blue feel aimed at me? Why does looking down feel almost unbearable when other people are snorkeling over it and discussing fish in the cheerful tone usually reserved for garden centres? That comparison with others makes the fear even more personal, because now it is not only about the ocean, it is about the self in relation to other selves. Everyone else appears to have made peace with the setting. I have not. That can make the fear feel like a personal failure rather than what it usually is, which is a very old, very direct response to hidden depth. And because the fear already draws attention inward, self-judgment can settle in fast. A person starts managing not just the water, but also the embarrassment of being the only one whose nervous system has clearly decided that enough is enough. The body remembers those moments too. It remembers the little rush of heat through the chest, the urge to pull the knees up, the sudden need to reach for something solid. the relief of getting back to shallows where the ground can once again be seen. Relief is an important part of the memory. It teaches the body that deep water was the problem and visible bottom was the solution. The next time, the fear may arrive even earlier, because the mind has learned a pattern it considers useful. Deep blue, loss of floor, personal alarm, return to safety, relief. Once that sequence is established, the deep begins to feel personal before one has even entered it. This is one reason some people are not frightened only in the water itself, but by the idea of the water ahead of time. They see a dock stretching over dark depth and already feel the body preparing. They watch a boat leaving harbour and feel uneasy long before any actual drop-off appears below. They see underwater footage of someone swimming above a dark shelf and immediately feel the familiar recoil in their own stomach, as if their nervous system would like it clearly noted that they, personally, would not be doing that. The fear has moved from event to expectation. It has become part of the self's relationship to the subject. There is also a very intimate mismatch involved in open water, and it has to do with body size. Human beings are not built to feel small in a neutral way. We may enjoy vistas, horizons, mountain views, and all the other scenic arrangements that make us look tiny in photographs, but actually feeling physically small inside a threatening environment is another matter. Deep water makes the body feel exact. One torso, 2 legs, a head full of air and nerves, a heartbeat, a certain amount of stamina, that is all. Against the scale below, the body becomes sharply aware of its own limits. And because those limits are your limits, not humanity's in some grand general sense, the experience lands personally. The deep also has a way of touching on very early fears without needing dramatic events. Babies dislike unsupported falling. Children dislike not knowing what is under the bed, behind the door, under the stairs, at the deep end. Adults like to imagine we have moved on from these things, but often we have simply given them better vocabulary. The ocean reaches right past the vocabulary and wakes the original pattern. No visible support. Unseen below. Movement from hidden space possible. That is old material. It does not arrive feeling academic. It arrives feeling mine. And because the fear is mine, the ocean begins to feel strangely conversational, even though it is not speaking at all. The body interprets the scene as if it is being addressed. The dark below is for me. The lack of footing is my problem. The unreadable depth is confronting me directly. That is what fear does. It converts condition into encounter. A wide, cold space becomes a personal moment. This is not a philosophical exaggeration. It is a plain description of what panic and dread do to perception. They take the world and bend it inward. Some of the most revealing examples of this happen when people are nowhere near actual danger and still feel the deep personally. Watching footage of a diver descending along a line into blue darkness. Looking at an image of a whale beneath a small kayak. Seeing a ladder vanish into black water under a dock. Hearing sonar pings in a documentary while the camera drifts over an unseen trench. None of these involve your real body being at risk. And still, the body may respond as though it has been implicated. That response tells us something important. The fear is not only about practical survival in the immediate moment, it is about identification. You place yourself into the scene at once. The hidden below becomes hidden below me, even while you remain entirely safe on a sofa. That ability to self-insert into the danger is one reason ocean fear can feel so vivid compared with more distant kinds of risk. You can hear about an avalanche or a volcanic eruption and feel concern without bodily ownership of the event. But a shot of dark water beneath a swimmer can produce immediate physical discomfort because the body knows how easily it could occupy that exact position. The scene is easy to inhabit mentally, and once inhabited it becomes intimate. One breath and you are in it. One kick and your legs are hanging there. One glance down and the floor is gone. All of this means that abyssophobia is not only a fear of the environment, it is a fear of the self in that environment, of what happens to my thoughts there, of what my body feels there, of how quickly my confidence leaves me there, of how little control I seem to have over the fear once it begins. For many people, that second part is almost worse than the water itself. They do not only fear the deep, they fear the version of themselves the deep wakes up, the one who scans, tenses, imagines, recoils, and cannot persuade the body to relax simply because logic has made a respectable attempt. That can make the fear feel deeply private. It becomes part of identity in a quiet way. I'm fine with lakes, but not when I cannot see the bottom. I'm fine on boats, but I cannot look over the side at night. I can swim in the sea, but not once it turns dark blue. I do not mind documentaries, except when the camera points down and there is only black beneath the diver. These little private rules become the map of a personal relationship to the abyss. They are not random quirks. They are the boundaries the self has drawn around a place it has learned not to trust. And still, even inside all that unease, there is often fascination. That is part of why the feeling runs so deep. People are not only repelled by the abyss, many are drawn to it as well. They watch videos that unsettle them. They look at images they know will produce that same cold internal drop. They stand at the edge of piers and glance down even when they dislike what happens next. It is not because they enjoy suffering. It is because the deep presses on something fundamental. It is frightening, yes, but also compelling in the way all large unreadable things can be. The personal quality of the fear is tied to the personal quality of the attraction. The sea is not just a threat in the mind. It is a question the mind keeps returning to. Perhaps that is because the deep does not only confront us with danger, it confronts us with scale, uncertainty, and the limits of what our senses can comfortably hold. That sort of confrontation is rarely neutral. It tends to stir something inward. Some people feel wonder first, then fear. Others feel fear first, then wonder, if they feel the wonder at all. But very few people feel nothing. The abyss does not pass through us casually. It asks, without asking, how much hiddenness can you tolerate? How much scale without structure? How much darkness below your body before the body begins to object? And the answer, for many people, is not very much, which is not weakness. It is simply a human answer. The deep feels personal because it reaches the body through exactly those channels where human beings are least abstract and most immediate: breath, sight, balance, memory, imagination, vulnerability. It does not need words to do that. It does not need myth, though myth certainly helps. It only needs hidden depth, and a person close enough to understand that the hidden depth is there. Once that understanding settles in, the fear becomes more than a reaction to scenery. It becomes part of how a person experiences their own smallness, their own limits, their own need for visible ground and knowable space. And from there, it is not a long step to a final, quieter realization, one that often sits underneath all the alarm without announcing itself too loudly. The deep does not only frighten us because it is dangerous, hidden, or immense. It frightens us because in some uncomfortable way, it reflects back the fact that there are limits to what we can know, hold, and stay calm inside. And perhaps that is where the fear becomes quietest and strongest at the same time. Not when something jumps from the water, not when a storm rises, not when the mind is busy inventing teeth for every dark shape below, but in that oddly still moment when you're simply there, suspended, drifting at the edge of water that no longer feels like a place and has begun to feel like a depth. Nothing may be happening. That is often the whole problem. The sea is calm, the sky is open, the surface moves only a little, and yet beneath you is darkness that does not explain itself, distance that does not offer an endpoint, and the deep, patient fact that the world below continues far beyond anything your body would prefer to verify. There is something almost unfair about how simple that moment looks from the outside. A person floating in the ocean can appear perfectly peaceful, arms spread, back on the water. Maybe the sun is low. Maybe the whole scene is beautiful enough to sell travel insurance and scented candles. But inside the body, an entirely different conversation may be taking place. The ears half listen for sound. The legs draw slightly inward without permission. The eyes keep wanting to check below and immediately regretting it. The chest remains just a little too aware of breathing. Beauty and alarm side by side. It is one of the stranger combinations the sea produces with almost no effort at all. Drifting is important here, because drifting removes one more layer of human confidence. Swimming at least feels active. A stroke has purpose. Forward motion creates the comforting impression that one is doing something about the situation, even if the situation has not technically asked to be solved. Drifting is different. Drifting asks for tolerance. It asks the body to remain in place, to let the water carry some of the work, to accept that the vast hidden space below can continue existing without immediate inspection. For a nervous system already unsettled by depth, this can feel like an outrage disguised as a relaxation technique. And yet, that is exactly the scene where the abyss often reveals itself most clearly. Not in panic, but in stillness. Not when the sea is dramatic, but when it is indifferent. A rough ocean is frightening in obvious ways. Waves hit, wind pushes, spray blinds, and every instinct understands why this is not the time for philosophical reflection. Calm deep water is more difficult because it leaves room for thought. It removes the convenient distractions. The body can feel every little shift, every rise and fall of the surface, every faint pull of current, every second in which nothing visible rises from below, and the mind still cannot quite settle. This is why people often say that dark open water feels endless, even when they know perfectly well it is not. Endless is not a measurement. It is a sensation. It is what happens when the eye loses the ability to organize what lies beneath, and the body responds as though the missing bottom has become infinite. The deep does not have to be literally bottomless to feel bottomless. It needs only to remain unconfirmed long enough for the mind to stop treating it like ordinary depth and start treating it like a condition without a boundary. That is the edge of the endless dark. Not a geological term, but a very human one. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that the edge often begins much closer than we would like. You do not need to be in the middle of the ocean to feel it. A few meters past a reef shelf, a sudden drop near a cove, the side of a boat at dusk, a lake where the dock ends and the water turns from green to black, a quarry with walls that vanish straight down, a flooded sinkhole where the visible ring of rock opens into shadow below. The endless dark does not always require enormous distance from shore. It only requires enough hidden depth for the body to stop feeling accompanied by the ground. That loss of accompaniment matters more than it sounds. On land, no matter how strange a place may be, there is usually some basic arrangement between the body and support. Floors remain underfoot. Paths continue. Gravity is unpleasant at times, but at least it behaves consistently enough to build furniture around. In deep water, that relationship changes. The body is held, but not in the familiar way. Support becomes dynamic, unstable, entirely dependent on breath, balance, and cooperation, with a medium that also refuses to show you how much more of itself lies below. The human nervous system does not always appreciate that kind of support. It likes guarantees, not conditional kindness. Still, people return to the sea. That is worth pausing over. For all the fear, all the tightening in the chest, all the involuntary respect we give a dark patch of water, once the seafloor disappears, people keep returning. They swim, they sail, they dive. They stand on piers and look down even when looking down reliably makes them unhappy. They watch footage of trenched descents and deep-sea creatures and underwater caves with the exact expression one wears, while choosing to be unsettled in a safe environment. This tells us something important. Fear of the abyss is not simple rejection. It often lives alongside attraction. That attraction is not mysterious once you think about it. Large hidden things pull at the mind. They do so partly because they are dangerous, and partly because they are incomplete. The deep sea withholds. It offers fragments, glimpses, odd facts, sonar maps, sudden creatures, and then closes again. Human attention does not love closure as much as we claim to. We say we want answers, but very often what we really want is the right kind of question, one big enough to keep the mind awake and cautious and interested. The abyss is an excellent supplier of such questions. It asks how much can exist below us without our understanding it. It asks what hiddenness itself does to the body. It asks how calm we really are when calm requires trust, in a place that has not earned it in the usual ways. And perhaps that is why drifting at the edge of the dark can feel almost ceremonial, not in any dramatic, mystical sense, just in the plain sense that the body knows it has entered a special condition. You're no longer simply swimming. You're negotiating with scale, hiddenness, and your own imagination all at once. You're trying to remain a modern person with sensible thoughts, while a much older set of instincts keeps saying, "Very well, but I would still prefer a visible floor and perhaps a towel." This split between thought and instinct gives the moment its peculiar tension. You know one thing, you feel another. Neither fully cancels the other out. Some people respond by leaving the water immediately, which is fair enough. There is wisdom in recognizing when an environment has asked too much of your nerves for one day. Others stay longer, testing the feeling. They float, they breathe, they keep glancing down in short, uneasy installments. They try to let the body learn that the hidden does not always become harm. Sometimes it works a little, sometimes it does not. Fear is not a neat lesson, and the sea is not a neat classroom. But even that effort tells us something about what abyssophobia really is. It is not merely the wish to flee. It is also the struggle to understand why the body objects so forcefully to a place that can, from another angle, seem almost serene. The sea is exceptionally good at holding these contradictions. It is peaceful and unsettling, empty and crowded, beautiful and difficult to look at for too long, calm at the surface and brutal in its physical realities. It lets a person float in sunlight while miles of cold darkness remain below. Very few environments create such a split between appearance and structure. Perhaps that is why deep water often feels more intimate than mountains or deserts, even though those two can overwhelm. The sea permits closeness. You can enter it. You can be held by it. And precisely because it permits that closeness, the hidden vastness underneath feels less like scenery and more like participation. There is another small cruelty in drifting, and it is that time changes there. Not actual measured time, of course, but felt time. A few seconds of looking into unreadable blue can stretch strangely. A minute of treading water while deciding whether to turn back can feel longer than reason would predict. This is common in fear. The mind thickens around uncertainty. It pays attention too intensely. It records too much. Later, those moments may seem longer, sharper, more personally significant than they objectively were. The body remembers the endless dark not because it literally lasted forever, but because fear turned ordinary duration into something denser. That density can remain for years. People often remember a single unsettling moment in deep water with remarkable clarity. The colour of the water, the angle of the light, the way the drop-off appeared, the sudden coldness below the knees, the exact point at which the sea changed from pleasant to unacceptable. Memory holds these details because they matter to survival learning, but also because the feeling itself is unusual. Few ordinary moments produce such a clean collision between beauty, vulnerability, scale, and uncertainty. The mind tags it carefully. It says, "Remember this. There was something important here, even if what was important was simply that the bottom was gone and your body did not care for the terms of the arrangement." And once such a memory exists, other waters begin borrowing its mood. A ferry at night, A dark pool with a deep end one cannot quite see. A bridge over black river water. Underwater footage from a documentary where the camera light fades into open blue. A submerged structure visible only in part. A ladder disappearing into a harbour. A whale passing under a kayak in a perfectly harmless and utterly unacceptable manner. The body does not always distinguish finely between these. It notices the family resemblance, hidden depth, unreadable below, possible emergence, uncertain support. That is enough. The endless dark has many addresses. Still, there is something honest in how the body reacts. For all the exaggeration fear can produce, abyssophobia is not invented out of nowhere. The deep ocean really is a place where humans are vulnerable. It really is a place of limited visibility, unstable support, difficult escape, and scale beyond comfort. The fear may overshoot. It may imagine too much. It may add teeth where there are none, and motives where there is only water being water. But beneath the embellishment is a truthful recognition. This is not our best setting. We can visit. We can learn. We can become skilled. Yet some older part of us remains unconvinced that hidden depth deserves casual trust, and in many situations that caution is not foolish at all. What makes the fear linger, though, is not only danger, it is also surrender. Drifting requires a kind of temporary surrender to conditions larger than oneself. You let the water hold you. You accept that there is more below than you can know in that moment. You accept that you cannot inspect every metre of dark beneath your body. That is difficult for a species that takes comfort in surveying, mapping, naming, and pretending that names have somehow completed the task. The ocean has names for its trenches, zones, currents, and ridges now, yes. It appears on maps, it appears in documentaries, but names do not flatten the feeling of floating above what remains physically beyond your grasp. And perhaps they should not. Perhaps part of the reason the abyss continues to trouble and fascinate us is that it resists becoming ordinary. So much of modern life encourages the opposite feeling. Everything is lit, labelled, searchable, reviewable, measured in app notifications and battery percentages. We are used to information arriving on demand. The deep sea does not care. It does not become reassuring because we have statistics. It does not become emotionally small because we have bathymetric charts. The abyss remains a place where reality is bigger than comfort, and the body notices that in a way the intellect cannot fully smooth over. This may be why even people who never intend to dive, sail or swim far offshore still feel something when shown the right image. A diver suspended over blue that falls way beneath him. A submersible light sweeping across black water and finding only particles. A drone shot of a lone swimmer in a circle of dark sea. A map of ocean depth where the coastline gives way to wide fields of blue and then darker bands and then trench. These scenes work because the fear does not require immediate danger to function. It requires only enough evidence that the hidden below is real and larger than the body would prefer. The rest is supplied by a nervous system that has been taking such cues seriously for a very long time. But after all that, after the fear, the stories, the muscles tensing, the old watchman in the mind refusing to take a night off, there is still a quieter truth beneath it. The fear of the abyss is also a kind of respect. Not always a graceful respect, certainly. Sometimes it looks more like backing hastily towards shore while insisting you simply remembered something important on land. But respect all the same. The deep forces honesty. It reminds a person that there are environments where human certainty does not count for much, where seeing less genuinely changes how safe one feels, where scale alone can unsettle the body without any further drama. That reminder can be unpleasant, but it is not empty. In fact, it may be part of why the sea remains so compelling in sleep stories, quiet documentaries, and late-night thoughts when the room is dark and the mind is not quite ready to let go of the day. The abyss gives shape to a very common human experience. We're not frightened only by what is dangerous. We are frightened by what is hidden, what is too large to read at once, what places us in contact with our own limits. The ocean makes that experience literal. It turns uncertainty into water, darkness into depth, exposure into a body floating above a drop. You do not have to be especially poetic to feel the effect. You only have to imagine looking down and seeing the world continue where your sight cannot. And perhaps this is where we finally return to that first simple moment, the one that began the whole fear. Not a storm, not a monster, not a great philosophical declaration from the sea, just a glance downward, that is all. A person in water, a body suspended, blue darkening beneath them, the floor gone, the mind leaning forward and backward at once, drawn and repelled, fascinated and unwilling, curious and ready to leave. So much begins there. The ancient caution, the imagined teeth, the tightening chest, the private feeling that the deep has somehow found the exact shape of one's vulnerability and pressed gently on it. And yet, if we stay with that image long enough, something else appears beside the fear. Not comfort, perhaps not quite, but recognition. Of course we fear it. Of course the body objects. Of course hidden depth in a place where we cannot stand, cannot breathe naturally and cannot see very far would wake all the old systems at once. There is nothing ridiculous about that response. It is part of being human in a world that still contains places much older, larger, and more difficult than we are. The deep ocean is one of those places. It does not need to be conquered in the imagination to be understood. It only needs to be met honestly. So if, somewhere in your own memory, there is a moment of dark water you still think about now and then, a moment when the sea turned from lovely to unbearable in a single glance, there is no need to dismiss it as foolish. The body was reading something real, even if it read too much of it too quickly. Hidden depth is a serious thing to a surface-dwelling mind. The abyss is not merely a background. It is a test of how much uncertainty we can float above before we begin wanting the ground back. Most of us, it turns out, want the ground back rather sooner than pride would like to admit. And perhaps that is all right. Not every fear is there to be defeated completely. Some are there to be understood, named, and carried a little more gently. The deep may always trouble certain people. Dark water may always produce that first inward drop. The legs may still draw up. The eyes may still refuse the long look downward, but once the fear is understood, it loses some of its loneliness. It becomes less like a private flaw and more like a familiar human response to a very old fact. Beneath the bright surface of the world, there are places where sight fails, scale expands, and the body remembers what it is. So as the water rocks gently, and the dark below remains dark below, and the mind does what minds do around things it cannot fully inspect, perhaps the kindest way to leave this thought is not with triumph, but with company. The sea remains vast. The abyss remains real. The hidden beneath us still has the power to tighten the chest and sharpen the imagination. But now, perhaps, it feels a little less shapeless, a little more understood, still deep, still dark, still entirely capable of making a sensible person reconsider a swim at the exact moment the water turns from clear to blue, but not incomprehensible, not nameless. And as the body drifts and the surface rises and falls in its slow, patient rhythm, the fear itself begins to look less like madness and more like what it has probably been all along, a human way of standing, or rather floating, at the edge of something too large to see through, and knowing it,